When the Avengers landed in theaters, it really changed the cinematic landscape. Studio heads started leaning into the idea of the cinematic universe, with meticulous continuity in films that all connected together to potentially create a larger narrative later on. This was a concept Marvel was pretty much created to do, and the comics medium always needed to refresh with new ideas, new characters, and so on for the universe staples to cross over with. This created thousands of superheroes for Marvel to work with, though notably characters like the Hulk, Spider-Man, Blade, Daredevil, and the Fantastic Four were all currently under different studios to various degrees, due to those properties being licensed out to adapt when Marvel, at the time somewhat independent, was facing financial troubles following a crash in the comics industry after the 90s speculation market caused sales to shrink. All this to say, Marvel had a hit with the Avengers, which before that film was Marvel's second biggest team under the X-Men, which was locked down by 20th Century Fox at the time. This meant Marvel had to look down its own well of characters that were languishing at other studios, and following the success of the Avengers, it was time for Marvel to see if they could keep it going following one successful round of film releases that brought the Marvel brand to new heights and created the MCU, an umbrella which eventually would see all the characters I mentioned before that were at other studios finding their way back to the principal IP holders down the line to some extent or another. Marvel Television around this time also started being added to the MCU, starting with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. These shows would be related to the MCU in that they followed events. However, aside from some major cameos, crossovers were pretty rare. While at the time these greatly expanded the universe's scale, back when the shows started coming out, the universe didn't quite have a system down for these, so a lot of these shows were of lower quality than the films and made some continuity inconsistencies. Eventually, Kevin Feige would announce in a roundabout way that these shows were no longer canon, but are part of the Marvel multiverse and count to some degree. It is also worth noting these shows were not actually created by Marvel Studios itself, rather it was made by Marvel Television and were allowed to play in the MCU sandbox, albeit with a smaller budget and very little connective tissue to the actual films. This has since been walked back slightly, with the Netflix Marvel shows being added back to continuity, in part to usher the backstory for the upcoming Daredevil Born Again TV show. With that said, I watched a season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and it was torture, so it works out nicely for me. I will review the Defenders shows, and actually I've already watched Daredevil, and I'm going to put those in their own video down the line. Though starting with WandaVision, when Marvel Studios took over production, I'll start adding those into their proper phases, but I'll skip the really cheap and boring ones that have since been retconned. When announced back in 2012, Marvel had announced a small handful of films following the Avengers. These included Iron Man 3, Thor the Dark World, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and the shocking reveal of Guardians of the Galaxy, which was then incredibly niche, based on a pretty short comic run from years earlier. Finally, Ant-Man, which at the time was set to be directed by Edgar Wright. However, it was not set in stone that Ant-Man would be included in Phase 2, originally being planned for Phase 3. That said, most of the slate actually went as planned from the time of its announcement. Iron Man 3 is the conclusion to the Iron Man trilogy, and much like how Iron Man opens the MCU with its first film, Iron Man again ushers us into the second chapter of the Marvel Universe and second act of the so-called Infinity Saga. I remember seeing this film and thinking it was pretty decent, though admittedly back in 2013, this was my least favorite of the trilogy. The changes to the character of Mandarin was a big point of contention to me initially, and while I now think Shane Black was the right choice for the film, at the time the director shift from Jon Favreau's popcorn style to the slightly darker take Shane Black wanted to tackle may have been a bit jarring for me. Again, this was the third film in a trilogy, otherwise helmed by Jon Favreau, and the first of the Marvel films to kind of have a dark side following the overall bright and enjoyable Phase 1. Following Phase 1's distribution deal with Paramount Pictures, Disney wanted to move the distribution house, and Marvel was no longer in need of a distribution partner since Disney bought out the company back in 2009, though Marvel was still obligated to work with the partners it established back with the first Iron Man film through Avengers, with Disney still having to fork over north of $100 million to have the rights to the characters established. Following Phase 1, back fully under the Disney umbrella from a distribution standpoint. It's worth noting this was a different deal than, say, Sony's with Spider-Man more recently, as it only has to do with distribution rights rather than IP rights creatively, which Sony has over the Spider-Man characters. Hence why the Hulk at the time still needed to be under the Universal umbrella, hence the Incredible Hulk being under Universal's distribution system rather than Paramount's. The legality is odd and really goes back to when Marvel first licensed its characters to keep the lights on, back with the first Blade and even before that with Roger Corman's Fantastic Four debacle. Regardless, Marvel starting with this film would mostly start distributing and releasing movies through their then semi-recent parent company Disney. Following the release of Iron Man 2, Jon Favreau stepped away from the Iron Man IP to focus on the then upcoming Magic Kingdom movie based on the theme park ride of the same name, though this would eventually be cancelled. That is a story I don't care to elaborate on further, but Favreau ended up stepping away and the search was on for a new director and new angle to take the character of Iron Man. Shane Black was picked in part due to his previous relationship with Robert Downey Jr., who worked with the director on his film Kiss Kiss Bang Bang back in 2005. Shane Black signed on, and the pair united to tie up the trilogy. Jon Favreau would also stay on as producer, consultant, and would reprise his role as Tony's friend and bodyguard, Happy Hogan, a role that he still holds to this day, most recently showing up in Deadpool and the Wolverine. Drew Pearce, who has sporadically worked in Hollywood throughout the years, was tapped to write the film with Shane Black, who initially was unsure of being more or less assigned a writing partner, but the veteran filmmaker relented after working through the story with Pearce for a couple weeks. Shane wanted to step back from the Iron Man versus suit-clad villain formula Favreau did with the first two films, opting to make it less superhero film and more action thriller, taking influence from authors like Tom Clancy. With the project having a foot in the comics, loosely adapting the extremist storyline from the Iron Man comics. As for the villain, a few people auditioned for the role beyond Ben Kingsley. As the face of the Mandarin at the time, the folks at Marvel auditioned a wide range of people for the role of the Mandarin, with Anthony Mackie, who would later be hired to portray the Falcon, trying his hand at the role. Of course, this probably helped him get a foot in the door at Marvel, and with his upcoming Captain America film, I am sure Mackie isn't losing any sleep over his initial failure to land a Marvel role. Chastain was considered for the role of Maya, but was eventually swapped for Rebecca Hall, and with the primary cast in place, the team went into filming. Filming took place from May 2012 to January 2013, and the film was put together for a May 2013 release. Iron Man 3 follows Tony Stark reeling from recent events in New York. His near-death experience to take down the Chitauri mothership had him shaken to his core, and Iron Man has become obsessed with his obsession of the Iron Man suits more than ever before, with the charismatic inventor creating a wealth of Iron Man armors and adding them to his arsenal, to the dismay of Pepper, who detects that Tony is starting to lose himself, compounded by dangerous encounters with him linking his brain to the armor.
Tony.
Meanwhile, Aldridge Killian, an inventor from back in the day that Tony blew off, has finally seen the fruits of his labors with the extremist property and his potential healing benefits starting to cross Tony and Pepper's radar. However, Tony is occupied with a new terrorist who is creating issues, the man called the Mandarin.
True story about fortune cookies.
The terrorist eventually crosses Tony when his friend Happy is caught up in one of these terrorist attacks and is critically wounded. Tony invites the Mandarin to face him and gives out his home address on TV, while Maya Hansen, a former lover of Tony's from the day he first met Killian, arrives to tell Tony something, and she may have if the Mandarin didn't mount his attack, destroying Tony's mansion, with he, Pepper, and Maya narrowly escaping the attack. Due to this, Tony is casted off to a small town in Tennessee, a coordinate in Jarvis's controls due to the recent Mandarin attack there. With a broken suit and the world presuming him dead, Tony decides it should stay that way until he can solve his problems with the Mandarin. However, a local kid, Harley, meets Tony and allows him to hide out at his place, helping him fix his critically damaged suit with what little supplies they have laying around. Tony quickly runs into some extremist thugs and figures out that they're injected with Maya's extremism extremist drug, and finds many of the extremist people he encountered were on AIM's payroll, a company owned by Killian, another person there the night that Tony met Maya. Seeing the connection, Stark knows he needs to meet Mandarin and figure out the whole story behind this, eventually tracking him down to Miami. There he finds a not-so-ruthless version of the supervillain Tony and the audience expected.
The Mandarin, the real guy.
Where? Where's the Mandarin? Where is it?
Whoa, he's here. He's here, but he's not here. He's here, but he's not here.
Rather, he was a bumbling actor. Stark realizes that there's no Mandarin, or at least not the one that was portrayed to the media, and figures out Killian is behind the plot. Tony goes after Killian, confronting him with the villain telling Tony he has Pepper hostage and injected her with extremists, her life in his hands, and at the same time he kills Maya, since she's starting to have a change of heart working with the villain after her compliance in the scheme and orchestrating Pepper's kidnapping with Killian. Meanwhile, Rhodey's armor is being piloted by Trevor Slattery to attempt to blow up Air Force One, though Tony shows up just in time to stop this, and the passengers, who are all jettisoned from the plane and almost perish, are saved by Iron Man just in time, though Killian now has the president hostage and tells the vice president that he will cure the vice president's sick daughter if he plays ball with Killian's plans for the country. Stark and Rhodey, now suitless, go off to Killian's location to save Pepper and the president, though this clearly proves to be a losing battle, that is until Tony activates a protocol, bringing all his old suits in as drones to come and fight Killian and his gang of extremist-powered henchmen. Tony eventually gets the best of him and Killian is killed by an extremist-empowered Pepper. Tony destroys all his suits, starting fresh, and finally letting Tony have some time away from his obsession. Tony ends up curing Pepper and gives Harley some new tech for his help during the events in Tennessee. As for the new characters, we have Jack Taggart, who in this film is just a henchman of Killian, but in the comics is a full character who has an armored suit and goes by Firepower, not unlike Iron Man himself. The character first appeared in Iron Man 230 from 1988, but in this film he never dons the armor, with the original character Trevor Slattery briefly donning Iron Patriot's armor for a short while. He was empowered by extremists, however. Another kind of weird thing is in the MCU, Jack Taggart is a white guy, though in the comics he's a black man, marking the only whitewashing I can remember in the whole of the MCU. Not entirely sure why they added this character to the film. The only thing I can surmise is perhaps in an early draft of the script, he was in his armor, and then that was cut when Shane Black decided he didn't want any armored villains, and the name was just kind of pulled through. I have no idea. Kind of a bizarre, light adaptation of this character. Aldrich Killian in the comics first appeared in Iron Man Volume 4, Number 1, and helped create Extremis along with Maya Hansen. In the film, Killian starts as a lonely, nerdy man and works his way up to an evil mastermind and gets superpowers from Extremis while running his company AIM, which in the comics is a major threat to Marvel, in the vein of Hydra, but more of a mad scientist angle. In the comic, Killian appears briefly in a single issue, committing suicide after selling his Extremis formula to terrorists, so they really took this character and ran with him, off of what little was really actually there from the source material, also adding a small level of surprise when the roles are reversed and the Mandarin is more or less a nobody rather than Killian. Maya Hansen first appeared along with Killian in Iron Man Volume 4, Number 1, and would survive for a long while, being an occasional side character in the Iron Man universe until Iron Man Volume 5, Issue 1, so more or less a volume. Maya was jailed for her involvement in the creation and abuse of Extremis, but eventually would repent and work with S.H.I.E.L.D. for a while, under Tony Stark while he was the leader of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a short time following Civil War. The comics are convoluted, but regardless, she was fairly accurate. Mandarin, or Trevor Slattery, is the film's big red herring, allowing for the film's big twist that Mandarin isn't really a thing in the universe. This was always a contentious adaptation, since Mandarin was always one of Iron Man's big bads, and probably the closest thing he had to a real long-standing rogue, since many of them wind up dead pretty fast in the comics. Mandarin first appeared in Tales of Suspense 50, a little bit into Iron Man's initial run, but still pretty early on in the grand scheme of things, and he's basically a super powerful warlord who harnesses the power of his 10 rings and carrying on his supposed heritage as the great-great-whatever grandson of Genghis Khan. Naturally, the tease of this modern version, where he is more of a Bin Laden-esque terrorist, is kind of fascinating. I actually never really got that mad about the twist. I mean, we were deprived of a more straight adaptation of the Mandarin, but down the line, Shang-Chi kind of sort of tried to rectify that situation, which sort of worked better for the character. I personally never really pined for Mandarin content. I just think he's sort of cool, but I didn't really lose sleep over the twist, honestly. Trevor is more memorable to me in hindsight than just some guy that shoots lasers at Iron Man for 15 minutes and then dies. Plus, the later version of the character that Tony Leung played was great, so fuck it, I'm happy. It worked out in the end. Look, I did this video in the past and decided to redo it because my first one was a little short and not very good, but what I noticed is there's nothing interesting I can really say on the inspirations of every Iron Man suit in this film, because while there are several new suits with cool designs, I think the film kind of just allowed concept artists to go crazy and create what they felt like making with a limited number that seemed to actually pull from the comics. So what I'm pulling up here is the graphic on screen that shows all the armors as of this film. Pretty fun stuff, kind of cool, I guess. Anyhow, let's discuss the few notable ones that I thought were worth mentioning. Mark 15 is an adaptation of Tony's stealth armor, or the Mark 7 in the comics, which first appeared in Iron Man 52 back in 1981. The stealth armor works for highly serialized adventures in the comics, but I think the filmmakers rightfully assumes this would probably be the best chance to actually bring this to screen, because what situation is Iron Man really going to wear this in a film? Mark 20 is based on the then new Iron Man Model 42 armor, which originated in Iron Man Volume 5, Number 1, and was the main Iron Man suit during this film's production back in 2012. Mark 33 is the Silver Centurion, or Model 8, in the comics, an armor that first appeared in Iron Man 200. It's an iconic armor, but since the films mostly kind of ape off the more modern era Iron Man costumes, going back to the costume Iron Man wore in the 80s would not be super impressive to anyone but the comic fans. With that said, a cool adaptation and a needed addition so fans could see this in live action. Mach 42, Tony's newest suit at the time of Iron Man 3, and the main suit he uses throughout the film. This armor is visually based on Iron Man Model 37 from the comics, which was his armor in 2010 to 2012's Marvel Now reboot, a surprisingly long time for an Iron Man armor to stay in circulation, since the character's suits became fascinating to people like myself. Model 37 appeared originally in Invincible Iron Man Volume 2, Number 25. Both suits are more rounded and more gold heavy than old versions, though this film definitely goes further on the gold. War Machine Mach 2 was seen painted to be the Iron Patriot armor, and is an all-around improved model to the War Machine Mach 1. And this appearance is based on Iron Patriot, which is an identity in the comics that was adopted by Norman Osborn when he was the leader of the Dark Avengers, a team of Avengers made up of disguised supervillains, first appearing in Dark Avengers number 1 from 2009. Obviously, due to the rights issues of the day, with Sony having a lock on Spider-Man and his IPs, Norman Osborn couldn't be used, so the suit was pivoted to fit for this film as it stands, with Rhodey as the suit's pilot rather than the Green Goblin. The characters of Iron Man 3 see a lot of closure from the first two Iron Man films, with characters such as Tony and Pepper getting some closure on the arcs of those films, with Tony not really getting another set of arcs for a while, until the two latest Avengers films, Infinity War and Endgame. Tony has PTSD from the events of the Avengers, which is perhaps a little jarring, following how that film ended, with the previous film ending with Iron Man and the gang eating shawarma, but in a lot of ways it makes sense. Avengers is the moment for Tony in the Infinity Saga, where the world takes a big step forward into grand world-shattering stakes, as well as Tony's, in a way, he feels like he might have ushered in. The Avengers were 4 warriors and soldiers: Thor, Black Widow, Captain America, and Hawkeye, with Hulk being a giant monster man. Tony was just a civilian a few years ago, and a worryless playboy, and as of Iron Man 3, he feels as though the weight of the world is squarely on his shoulders. He was never really trained for this.
How did he get out of the wormhole?
Wait a minute, Tony. What you say, Tony?
This causes Tony to make dozens of suits, start being slightly estranged from his girlfriend Pepper, and occasionally thinking of his own mortality. This obsession with being prepared for the next potential invasion has caused him to live in his own world. When Maya Hansen appears, Tony sees demons from his past emerge. Add that to the Mandarin starting to cause fear, a challenge Tony underestimates following the Avengers' big debut and Tony's growing ego. It isn't until Tony puts his real life first and sacrifices his suits that he manages to defeat Killian and change his focus on the next chapter in his life. The film slightly implies this may be retirement, though. Of course, his adventures would continue in the Avengers films. I like this arc. Tony went from self-obsessed in the first few scenes of his original films to obsessed with his suits, and by the end he manages to find a better balance. It's pretty well done, even if the Avengers kind of hand-waves the arc later on. Pepper is obsessed with the toll Tony's life has suffered due to his obsession with being Iron Man and what being a superhero costs him. This leads to some tension in their relationship. Tony is obviously unwell, which she sees firsthand when Tony, during a nightmare, almost causes Mark 42 to attack her in the dead of night. She's initially fascinated by Killian's process on Extremis till her meeting with Maya Hansen and learning of the potential dangerous uses of the theoretically perfect drug for regenerating cells from diseases and the like. Eventually she's infected with Extremis, and it's only with her help that Tony is able to overcome Killian, though superheroing is not for her, so she's cured of Extremis by the end of the film. Killian starts off as an optimistic inventor, one which is notably comically small and weak, to the point he is almost a cartoon character.
Advanced Idea Mechanics, or AIM for short. Do you get it?
I see that because it's on your t-shirt.
However, he eventually perfects the Extremis drug, allowing him powers beyond his wildest dreams and making him more normal, if not extraordinary. Killian is haunted by the denial Tony gave him at that New Year's Eve party years earlier, and has since worked to formulate not only his downfall, but also looking for revenge on a world which has been cruel to him back when he was a young theoretical scientist. Using Extremis to become the terrorist Mandarin, though notably, Mandarin doesn't really exist, which leads us to Trevor, or the Mandarin, who is the figurehead of Killian's plan, basically just a mascot to throw authorities on a wild goose chase. Trevor pretends to be a powerful, vain terrorist who can conquer the world after bringing it to its knees. In reality, Trevor is just a washed-up Hollywood actor who never made it, but is able to fade into his character and be fairly anonymous due to his low stature, sitting somewhere near the bottom of society.
They approached me about the role, and they knew about the drugs.
What did they say? They get you off them?
Said they'd give me more.
The cover even tricks Tony for a time, but ultimately Tony and the audience meet the true Trevor, who is vain like the Mandarin, but it's more for drugs, women, and the fancy mansion he's put up in over the actual power someone like the Mandarin could hold. Trevor is dumb and is easily manipulatable, something that flies in the face of the man of legend he claims to be. Down the line in Shang-Chi we see more of Trevor, but in some point in the future we'll discuss that. Maya's the brains behind Extremis, the other half of Killian's puzzle, who wasn't necessarily shunned by society the way Killian was, but perhaps fittingly had a one-night stand with Tony the day he met and subsequently blew off Killian. Maya sides with Killian, mostly wanting her Extremis work off the ground. Of course, due to Tony and Pepper's bleeding hearts, they quickly trust her, and that eventually leads to Pepper being captured, and when Maya is no longer useful, her death. Rhodey is back, and this time he's the Iron Patriot rather than War Machine, something the government suggested would help his image, much to his dismay. Again, he's a confidant of Tony, but takes a bit of a back seat, with Tony leaving to investigate Extremis and faking his death and all that. After the kidnapping of the president, he does reconverge with Tony to help save the day. Happy, similarly, is still Tony's loyal, if a bit goofy friend. While following a shady character that ends up being an Extremis agent, Happy is injured and almost killed, being incapacitated and leading Tony to call out the Mandarin, which puts the larger plot into motion.
My name is Tony Stark, and I'm not afraid of you. I know you're a coward, so I've decided that you just died, pal.
Happy is definitely more of a functional character to the plot, but charming as ever. Harley is the final character, and it's just kind of your generic kid sidekick that helps hide out Tony, and ultimately leads to him having an opportunity to go head-to-head with Killian. He reflects Tony a bit as well, being a young kid that tinkers, something that Tony relates to, causing them to grow a quick kinship. Though Harley only appears in a large role in this film, he does cameo in Avengers Endgame at Tony's funeral. Tonally, Iron Man 3 is primarily a dark film with Tony's mental state deteriorating and more gritty realism and personal attachment to the leads. It's certainly not the largest scale for a Marvel movie, being intimate for the franchise, which is still fairly large in scale. It is still a Marvel film after all. The film has goofy moments too. Trevor was a shocking twist, though he's certainly also one of the funnier characters in the film due to how odd and surreal the reveal is, along with Ben Kingsley just chewing up the scenes as Trevor. Musically, the film isn't all that special in the grand scheme of things. The movie's score isn't bad, but it just doesn't stick out. It was composed by Brian Tyler, who works frequently, but honestly, looking over his filmography, I can't really think of anything too memorable he's done. Definitely not bad, however, he doesn't have the voice of a superstar composer like Hans Zimmer, John Williams, or Alan Silvestri. Jeffrey Ford, who worked on numerous Marvel films, was the lead editor, along with Peter S. Elliott, who has been editing and doing effects since the early 90s. It's pretty solid. I can really only think of one Marvel project with bad editing, so I don't think it'll come as a surprise when I say it's pretty good. The action is well done, the story is clear, and I think the story is pretty concisely shown. John Tall shot the film, and he's worked in the industry for over 50 years. He's a pro shooting films like Almost Famous, Tropic Thunder, Vanilla Sky, and more, working across genres and attitudes. I think the shot composition is pretty great. Nice lighting throughout, much of the film, and a number of interesting shots. I will say some of Marvel's ultra-bright lighting and stage-like sets do make the film look a bit flat in some sequences at places like Stark Tower or Tony's garage, but for the most part it looks solid enough. I think this is also around the time a Marvel style started forming, hence the consistent looks throughout all the films, and I think that really started in the Avengers, which was somewhat boring to look at for me, and was really bad throughout most of Phase 2. Though I will say, when there's an opportunity to add some flair to the shots, it was added. Also, the CGI looks great in a relative sense. It has less CG than many of these films, but when it's used, it looks good, especially Tony's suits, which each look great, and things like the Air Force One rescue just look awesome and are some of the most memorable moments in the MCU for me. Iron Man 3 has an end credit scene that features Tony talking to Bruce Banner in something of a therapy session,
And the fact that you've been able to help me process.
recounting the events of the film to Bruce Banner, who slept through much of what Tony said. While this is by no means a crazy deep end credit scene, it's meant to, I think, keep the train rolling on the idea of the MCU being this expansive shared universe beyond just the Avengers crossover films. It set the precedent that any character can show up anywhere. Nothing huge in terms of foreshadowing, however, it is something worth noting since it does kind of set up this new mentality that they start building on in Phase 2 of this fairly novel shared universe concept. I really enjoyed Iron Man 3. In fact, I really liked the Iron Man trilogy as a whole. I think there's a retrospective problem of Iron Man in that Iron Man just kind of keeps living his life business as usual after this film, appearing in a fresh new Iron Man armor in his next appearance, and being a superhero again. Like Iron Man 2, I think Tony is a character that always learned something in each installment, a new lesson, but always had to walk it back a bit so that he can start from Phase 1 in the following movie. I also thought the music was a bit bland, and Killian being basically Quasimodo at first, then becoming hunky Guy Pearce was a little cheesy. Though with all that said, the film has a lot of pretty moments, despite some occasionally flat cinematography. Tony's arc of letting go of Iron Man, at least for a while, was pretty sweet, not to mention the twist that Trevor was the Mandarin. It's pretty great. I love that twist, especially now that they did a fairly cool take on the Mandarin later on with Shang-Chi. The set pieces are crazy, and I think the airplane rescue will forever be one of my favorite moments in the MCU. Robert Downey Jr. and the cast again proved to be compelling in their roles, and Robert Downey Jr.'s darkness and charm he switches between with ease was a great addition, and I have to admit, Tony is such a charming character that you have to root for the guy. Overall, really liked this movie. Rotten Tomatoes saw a 79% for Iron Man 3, while Metacritic was at a 62 out of 100. Critics mentioned that the film had some flimsy elements, like the quickly dropped and perhaps dreaded kid sidekick. The relationship problems between Tony and Pepper repair a bit too fast, and the film just lacked some spectacle of the previous entries. The film, however, proved the new potential of the Marvel brand and made $1.2 billion on a budget of $200 million, and perhaps cemented the dynasty of Marvel that was only going to grow following the spectacle of the Avengers. Thor: The Dark World is the second film in Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the second film of now 4 films based on the hero Thor. This has never been the most loved film in the MCU, and for a long while I didn't watch end to end. Now I think I saw it in its entirety twice, but when I first saw it back in 2014, I fell asleep probably 20 minutes into the film and just rode it out sleeping, I guess. I also feel like this is one of the least memorable films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I am literally writing this retrospective the day I've watched the film, and it doesn't really stick in my mind that much because everything, from the hero to the villain, just falls a bit short and is kind of bland. Production on Thor: The Dark World started before the release of the first film, with Kevin Feige confirming out the gate that Thor would have sequels. Don Payne, who wrote the first film, was working on ideas before the first film came out and would ultimately come up with the final script concept used, though the film would be completed after he passed away from bone cancer in 2013. The initial release date planned by Disney was July 26, 2013, but that would later be moved to November 2013, and Kenneth Branagh decided to opt out of returning for the sequel due to the fact that it needed to be a fairly fast turnaround, and the amount of work that the first film took, likely multiplying even for the second entry. Patty Jenkins, director of Wonder Woman down the line, was in negotiations to direct, but that ultimately fell through in December 2011 due to the ever-classic creative differences that are oh so common at Marvel, with her plan being to make a Romeo and Juliet-esque concept between Thor and Jane, which Marvel wasn't all that interested in pursuing to the level Patty wanted. Daniel Minahan and Alan Taylor were considered as replacements, with both having worked on other fantasy works like HBO's Game of Thrones, though Alan Taylor was ultimately chosen to direct. Mads Mikkelsen and Benedict Cumberbatch were both considered for Malekith, but the role fell through for Benedict Cumberbatch, who would eventually go on to play the role of Doctor Strange for the franchise. Christopher Eccleston ultimately got the role, who's probably most notable for playing the Doctor in Doctor Who for a long time, along with several other roles. In late 2012, the film started shooting, with it all being completed in mid-2013 for release later that year. The plot follows Thor, who's back on missions with his pals, the Warriors 3 and Sif, who are defending the Nine Realms, with Thor not having been on Earth for very long, bar his brief stint as an Avenger, fighting against his brother in the Avengers film. Loki is now a prisoner on Asgard, and things are kind of back to normal. That is, until back on Earth, Jane Foster and her assistant Darcy discover a strange, parking structure that has cosmic abnormalities, which eventually leads Thor back to Earth to see what's going on and meet with his former flame, Jane. Jane, however, fell in one of these anomalies and is now infected with a strange burst thing that causes her to repel people, so Thor takes her off to Asgard to investigate. The Asgardians investigate what's happening to Jane. It is, however, Odin himself who knows what's happening, and that the abnormality is the power of the ether, the film's MacGuffin, and also what would later become Thanos' Reality Stone. Odin says that the Dark Elves once used it to try to destroy the Seven Realms. They look to find out how to remove the Aether from her without killing her, while Jane meets Thor's mom, Frigga. However, the Aether wakes the Dark Elves from their stasis that was imposed upon them by Thor's grandfather, Bor, generations earlier. Malekith, the leader of the Dark Elves, mounts an assault on Asgard that causes serious damage, but Frigga manages to fight off Malekith until she's ambushed and killed. Thor wounds Malekith and the Dark Elves retreat to regroup as Thor mourns his fallen mother. Odin locks up Jane to sort stuff out, but Thor knows that won't work and that the Dark Elves will return, So he takes Loki, who is equally torn up about their mother's death, the Warriors 3, Sif, and Jane, and they flee to confront the Dark Elves, though the Warriors 3 and Sif have to stay back as a diversion for the rest of the Asgardians, and to, I guess, make the climax less bloated, I don't know. Thor, Jane, and Loki confront Malekith, who manages to take the power of the Aether from Jane and attempts to attack Earth after supposedly killing Loki. Thor teams up with his Earth friends, Jane, Darcy, Darcy's intern, and Dr. Selvig to defeat Malekith with Dr. Selvig's new teleporting invention thing. Anyhow, they fight and Thor wins the battle, teleporting Malekith's giant ship on top of him, killing the villain. On Asgard, we learn that Loki was indeed alive, and seemingly held his father hostage and is impersonating the King of Asgard. Along with the returning characters Thor, Odin, Jane, Darcy, the Warriors 3, and Sif, Thor the Dark World introduces some new characters to the fold, mostly just new villains, but regardless, we had Malekith the Dark Elf, who was created by legendary Thor writer Walter Simon and first appeared in Thor 344 from 1984, being a pretty frequent adversary of Thor throughout the years. Admittedly, Thor has never been one of my favorite heroes since fantasy isn't really my thing, but I know enough about Malekith that I think they did a solid job bringing him to live action. Curse of Algrin showed up in this film, first appearing in Thor 347 along Malekith as kind of the muscle role, and that role kind of continues in this film. This film kind of has a bloated cast, as was the problem with the first few Thor movies. I feel like Kenneth Branagh kind of wanted this epic journey tale or something and introduced this whole huge cast, and this film was forced to kind of deal with them despite not really having much to do with them.
I will give you as much time as I can. Thank you, my friend.
Thor is obviously the lead of the film, following the events of the Avengers and the first Thor film. Thor has grown a closer attachment to the people of Earth, and this leads him to constantly think about Earth and his love Jane, who, following the first film, he could not see at first. Then he kind of just didn't bother seeing her following the events of the Avengers, with him being busy with all the Nine Realms shit. Thor eventually gets pulled into this adventure as Jane and her crew discover the anomaly, and Thor wants to investigate, eventually leading to the liberation of the Dark Elves after their long, hibernation, I guess. Thor is sad when his mom dies. This is his first real loss as a space demigod. However, as you may know, if you watch this franchise, this is far from Thor's only loss. This is something that Marvel seems to kind of replay repeatedly, which I think they comment fairly brilliantly in Thor 4, despite that movie being mostly pretty bad. Loki also returns, now a prisoner following the assault on Earth he headed during the Avengers. At first he is passive, but when his mom dies he joins Thor out of grief, and eventually uses his freedom as a way to get a hold of the throne of Asgard by faking his death in Loki's second death fake out of the franchise notably, and taking his seat on the throne of Asgard. Jane Foster is obsessed with Thor to an almost annoying extent. She's trying to date other people, but only thinks of Thor. Her research has become a means to an end in finding Thor, but honestly, Thor just wants to do space shit. She's eventually possessed by the Aether, and this leads her to have some adventures on Asgard and her reuniting with Thor. Malekith takes this power eventually, but it doesn't lead to much consequence for Thor. By the end of the film, Jane kind of is just in the same place she is before, seemingly, and is kind of left there, as we wouldn't see her again for a long time in the MCU until the aforementioned Thor 4. Darcy, likewise, is just comic relief, who eventually makes out with her assistant a few times. I don't know. It's whatever. I don't care about this character.
I hate you.
The Warriors 3 and Sif are here, and like in the first movie, they don't really have any character and are really only here to be background characters in fight scenes. Odin doesn't trust Jane Foster for being human and is sad when his wife dies. That's about it from him. Frigga is Odin's wife and likes Jane Foster and is a loving mother. Definitely more of a free spirit than Odin, though. She eventually dies, and this kind of kicks the climax into gear, but otherwise, she's pretty much just a functional character. Eric Selvig is crazy following the events of the Avengers, but eventually helps Jane save Thor in the climax. He's not super notable in this movie. Malekith and the Dark Elves want the power of the Aether to control the 7 realms. That's his whole character. He was a cool design, but he isn't really anything too deep. He's just kind of a generic villain character. Thor the Dark World certainly has literal darker moments than the first, with the cinematography being quite dark, but while the filmmakers say this film is really dark, it's actually not really that dark. It's really just a generic Marvel film aside from Frigga's death, and nothing too, like, edgy happens, you know? In fact, everyone seems to be in perpetual good mood, with lots of fucking jokes told constantly, which is a problem with Phase 2 especially. They really got addicted to telling jokes after Joss Whedon's Avengers, like everybody's quipping constantly. Hell, the scene where Loki and Thor steal one of the Dark Elf spaceships, every line is a joke or a quip, and this is moments after their mother dies, so you'd think they'd be like a little sad or torn up or something.
Now they're firing at us.
Yeah, thank you for the commentary, Loki. It's not at all distracting.
Well done. You just decapitated your grandfather.
Some of the quips are actually earned, but I think post-Avengers, the focus group said keep pumping in the observational humor, and it kind of undercuts the supposed dark tone of this film and a lot of tones in the MCU. It's a pretty consistent problem. I don't think a quip in a dark moment is bad for someone like Spider-Man or Iron Man, as Robert Downey Jr. plays him, but Thor, I think we need some moments where this warrior is solemn and sad if we're gonna go dark with it. But I think they just wanted to add some personality because he's so flat in the first film. I do admit though, imagery like Loki's death is kind of dark, with Loki very visually dying, but then he's just alive again a few scenes later. It undercuts itself so much that I question what the tone of this film actually is. Like, I don't know what the director was trying to capture here. Musically, this film sounds terribly generic. Brian Tyler did the music, and much like Iron Man 3, which he also did, it's just slow and boring. I even thought about it when the end credits started and the music kicked in. I was like, wow, this is underwhelming. But the interesting thing is, of course, I have no recollection of what that song even remotely sounds like, which I think is kind of the key to how underwhelming it is. But the days of Danny Elfman and John Williams scores were in the past, and so too was the consistency of music in the superhero film genre. Dan Lebenthal and Wyatt Smith edited this film, and it's fine. The film looks mostly good, but I think the story is a little jumbled, which I think was more of an issue with the script than the editing, but at points I had trouble following this pretty basic story because there were so many characters, so many MacGuffins, weird names of people that don't really do anything particularly special and stuff like that. From an action standpoint, they did a great job, and both Dan Lebenthal and Wyatt Smith have decent filmographies, with the former doing films like Iron Man, Spider-Man Homecoming and more, and the latter doing Doctor Strange and Mary Poppins Returns and stuff. They're definitely house directors for Disney, and it isn't crazy what they did here, but besides the slightly bloated script, I think they did a pretty solid job of gluing this movie together. Kramer Monthengau did the cinematography and is known for films like Chef with Jon Favreau and many Marvel films, along with the upcoming Captain America Brave New World film. And I think if there's anything I like about this film, it's the cinematography and visuals. The first Thor film, if I'm being blunt, looks like washed out dog shit, and this film adds some grime to Asgard. Everything is dark and contrasts well, with tons and tons of red put in the film, which is probably non-coincidentally the color of the Reality Stone and the Aether, as well as many of the Dark Elves' tools and weapons. The contrast is cool, and despite being such a dark color palette, the film manages to be very legible and not look too much like other films of the genre. It's not Alien vs. Predator Requiem where you can't tell what's going on. For such a dark color palette, it actually looks quite good. I know a lot of directors were doing darker paletted films at this time, where they were tempted to rip off the look of Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, specifically the middle film, The Dark Knight, but that's not really what they did here. It's kind of unique, and I respect that. I think it actually looks pretty nice and unique for a Marvel film of this era. The end credits scene sees the Warriors 3 and Sif giving the Collector the Aether, not knowing that the demigod was already on a quest to collect the stones for their power.
I can assure you, it will be absolutely safe. Yeah.
This, of course, pays off later on and connects directly to the plot of Guardians of the Galaxy, where the Collector's attempting to get the Power Stone. Good post-credit scene. It gives us a taste of the galactic adventures in the MCU, as well as introducing us to an important character that would soon be paid off more in the Guardians of the Galaxy film. I think along with the solid-looking CG and cinematography, the Dark Elves look cool, and I like the featureless masks and white complexions. It looks cool and adds contrast to the very dark film. Black and white is literally the most contrastable color. Their ships and weaponry are also good. Moments like their assault on Asgard are very Star Wars-esque, with the minions feeling kind of like stormtroopers, but the battles are pretty fun and the ship weapons are designed very well. And while totally unpractical, I kind of like the look of their black hole grenades. That effect was pretty cool and memorable the few times they did it. The film also chose to be on Earth way less, which is a good thing. I will admit also choosing London instead of the extraordinarily boring small town in New Mexico from the first film was pretty much an automatic step up in visual interest. But still, when I come to see a Thor movie, I need to see some unique and godly environments, and this film for the most part delivers. The Foley is distracting in this movie. At 3 points, Jane slaps people, and the effect is so loud and just sounds like a stock effect I'd get in a cheap sound effect pack, not something made for a major Hollywood production. I rarely talk Foley in these videos, but it actually took me out of the film at a few places for sounding just so off-kilter. Also, Loki fake dies again, which is just stupid. The end of the first Thor saw Loki seemingly die, which they never explained. He just kind of shows up in the Avengers. And at the end of that film, it was implied Thor was stuck on Asgard, but he just kind of shows up in the Avengers. Something that even bothered me at 14 years old, to the point that the end of that film was kind of ruined for me. He acted like there'd be some grand journey back, but the release schedule was coming up and they knew Avengers was pretty much next. So to see them fake Loki's death again, only to come back as Odin or something like that, is not very satisfying, and it's kind of obnoxious in my opinion. It just adds to how jumbled this film's plot is. Finally, the quips are starting to get bad and added heavily into the Marvel formula. The constant annoying jokes are a major problem for me with this franchise, since it just often becomes a bit too much. Overall, Thor: The Dark World is fine. The plot is so jumbled with so many moving pieces that it makes the plot hard to follow and forgettable, despite the fact that you lay it out and it's not very complex. I do, however, think Malekith and his henchmen look cool and are visually very memorable, along with the pretty good looking cinematography and CGI in my opinion. I think the quips in the human plot are annoying and unnecessary, and I think Thor was kind of left in an odd spot post-Thor 1 and Avengers, that much of this movie just feels odd, and perhaps at points this movie feels more obligatory than something someone actually really felt like they needed to make. I don't know who wanted to talk about Thor fighting the Dark Elves, and I don't know who wanted to see it. I just don't think there's many people that were clamoring for that. Thor 2, The Dark World, ended up making $645 million off of a budget of around $150 to $270 million. Why the estimated budget has that large of a range, I have no idea. It definitely didn't reach the height of Avengers or Iron Man 3, but it still seemingly did well enough to warrant more attention on future Thor adventures, along with definitely riding the hype train of the Avengers a bit. Thor 2 ended up with 67% on Rotten Tomatoes and a Metacritic score of 54 out of 100. The film received mixed reviews, with much of the praise going to Tom Hiddleston's Loki, who admittedly was still riding off of Avengers hype. Everybody loved him at the time. And the film was such a bad experience for Alan Taylor, who in 2021 said he wished he could do a director's cut in the same vein as Zack Snyder's Justice League. Though, as I've said on this channel a few times, that was an incredibly rare case, and I don't think many Marvel fans really care enough about Thor and this film to pull together and make something like that happen, on top of Snyder's cut being largely put out to fill out the gap in productions during COVID-19. And overall, I just think fans largely think this is one of the least memorable films in the MCU. They used to often be featured at the bottom of people's ranking lists and stuff. It wasn't uncommon to see it be kind of the punching bag of the MCU for a long while. The film was nominated for a bunch of awards for televised events, for example the MTV Movie Awards Best Shirtless Performance for Chris Hemsworth, but it failed to win anything like that even. Personally, I think Chris Hemsworth was robbed.
What did she say?
Captain America the Winter Soldier is one I was very excited for back in the day. Captain America is one of the weirdest characters in comics when it comes to lore and history. This man died and came back a few times, had numerous people hold the shield in his place, and is both very patriotic and isn't occasionally. This really interested me when the film dropped while I was in high school, and Captain America was definitely one of those characters that I read the most at the time. This film did not disappoint. While I do think the first Avenger had kind of a rushed second act, but it was pretty decent, though this film blew that away and set a new prestigious standard for the MCU that I think Phase 1 lacked, with those films being widely viewed as comic book films with a cool gimmick that they all came together at the end. This is around the time I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe became a brand with some level of prestige, and for a lot of films and comic fans, had sort of a step up in quality over the rival studios Fox and Sony when it came to Marvel characters. The brand would obviously strengthen to the point that only Sony does Marvel movies still, and they even had to creatively entrust Spider-Man, the whole foundation of their film division, to the hands of the MCU eventually. Needless to say, I like this film quite a bit back when it was released in 2014. Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, the writers behind much of the MCU, including the initial Captain America trilogy, Thor the Dark World, and Avengers Infinity War, would be set to write the sequel to the first Avenger before the film came out. Joe Johnston, who directed the first film, wasn't really interested in going further, liking the concept of the first film, then moving on, leaving an open director's chair Marvel needed to fill fairly quickly, interviewing three main candidates, George Nelfi, F. Gary Gray, and the Russo brothers. After some deliberation, the Russos landed the role and were previously primarily known for comedy TV shows like Arrested Development and Community, but would later go on to become key architects in the MCU following this film. Again, the concept of the film, much like Iron Man 3 and Thor, was to see what was going on with Captain America in the wake of the Avengers and the Battle of New York. The film's concept initially considered having some flashbacks to flesh out the World War II Captain America lore more, but eventually it was decided to just move forward beyond the origin and set it in modern day fully, kind of like later MCU entries, Captain Marvel, which set the first film in the past and the second in the present. The writers decided to shift the tone of the work a bit from the first, opting to adapt the Winter Soldier comic by Ed Brubaker and Steve Epting, a story which was more rooted in espionage and conspiracy over the punching Nazi roots of the character they adapted the first time pretty accurately, setting a new tone for Captain America's franchise, and a tone that would inform his and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s place in the MCU moving forward. The filming went smoothly, with the project shooting in 2012, much like Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World had. Emily Van Camp got the role of Sharon Carter in the film, but was almost handed to Karen Gillan, who instead would go on to play Nebula in the Guardians of the Galaxy films, and Anthony Mackie, who almost had the Mandarin role in Iron Man 3, ended up as the Falcon. Otherwise, the cast largely pulled from the Avengers, as many of the cast members from the first film's characters were now elderly. That said, Haley Atwell reappeared as Peggy, and Sebastian Shaw would return as Bucky, or in this case, the film's namesake of the Winter Soldier. 2 years following the Battle of New York, Captain America is now an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., lacking a place in the world really, when he meets a new friend, Sam Wilson, at the S.H.I.E.L.D. base. However, Black Widow is set up to go on a mission and needs Steve's help, and recruits him to invade a private vessel holding several hostages. Widow, however, has her own mission on the ship, trying to recover some S.H.I.E.L.D. intel, while Captain America saves the hostages, fighting Batak the Leaper. Steve is furious to find out that Widow had her side mission during the quest to save the hostages, though Nick Fury tries to calm this by letting Captain America in on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s largest project, Project Insight, which would see powerful helicarriers able to neutralize threats before they come to be. This makes Steve even more angry, not believing that they should attack on suspicion alone, seeing it as essentially domestic terrorism in a lot of ways. Nick Fury tries accessing the USB drive with the data that Widow stole on the barge, but realizes the information is encrypted. Starting to sense wrongdoing, Nick Fury tells Alexander Pierce, who's on the Council of World Security, to hold off on Project Insight for now until this could all be figured out, though as he exits his meeting, he's attacked by assassins led by none other than the strange new threat, the Winter Soldier. Nick Fury escapes and gives the information to Steve, only to get sniped. Nick survives, but fakes his death, going off the grid while Captain America pursues the assassin, the Winter Soldier, but the assassin escapes, and Captain America meets with Secretary Pierce to try to figure out what exactly is going on. While leaving his meeting with Pierce, much like Nick, he too is ambushed and narrowly escapes after a fight with numerous agents in an elevator. Pierce declares Captain America a public enemy and claims he knows information on Fury's supposed death that S.H.I.E.L.D. is unaware of. Captain America recruits Black Widow to help him figure out what's on the USB, though they are unable to decipher the info, but find out where the information came from initially, which led them to Camp Lehigh, where Steve trained during World War II. Here they find a ghostly computer program featuring Armin Zola, one of Captain America's adversaries during World War II, who was recruited by S.H.I.E.L.D. following the war.
And when history did not cooperate, history was changed.
That's impossible. S.H.I.E.L.D. would have stopped you.
Zola reveals that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been taken over the past 7 decades, slowly and meticulously, which distracted the two long enough for the fort to be struck by a missile, almost killing the 2 Avengers. The 2 manage to live and go to the one man Steve thinks he can trust, Sam Wilson, who agrees to join, revealing that he was part of the initial test for a flight suit that he uses to adopt the identity of the Falcon, joining Black Widow and Captain America to try to retake S.H.I.E.L.D. and bring security back to America. They infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. before the Hydra agents launch Project Insight, leading to an internal civil war between Hydra S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents that were not affiliated with Hydra, while Captain America and Falcon try to stop the release of the helicarriers, and Black Widow stops the compromised Alexander Pierce from seizing control of the World Security Council. Alexander Pierce is killed in the confusion, and while one of the helicarriers falls back to the surface, Captain America is forced to confront the Winter Soldier, who turns out to be his old friend Bucky, as he suspected, who actually managed to survive due to some Hydra experiments while he was prisoner during the first film, making him a super soldier in his own right, with a cybernetic arm fitted by Hydra and the Russians. The helicarrier collapses, and while it seems Captain America may die, the Winter Soldier saves him before fleeing, leaving Cap determined to save his friend with the help of his new ally, Sam Wilson. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s files were also leaked, which leads to Black Widow's past, along with all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s information being out there to the public. Black Widow heads off for now to find herself. Nick Fury, on the other hand, wants to stay dead as far as the world's concerned, leaving his fate only known by Maria Hill, Captain America, Sam Wilson, and Black Widow. A few characters first appeared in this film, which would really create the basis for Captain America's franchise moving forward. Alexander Pierce in this film is an evil secretary, and the leader of Hydra, who is more or less the main villain of the film. In the comics, the character is just a S.H.I.E.L.D. sleeper agent who acted as a confidant for Nick Fury during a similar takeover in the comics. He first appeared in Nick Fury vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. number 3 from 1988. No idea why this character was picked to be the villain, in a decidedly different role than in the comics, but he also isn't a character used particularly often, so I guess it didn't really matter, I guess. Falcon, or Sam Wilson, shows up here as a new friend of Captain America that would eventually become an Avenger in the MCU, and later down the line, following Avengers Endgame, the new Captain America, all of which is pretty true to the comics by this point. Falcon first appeared in Captain America 117 from 1969 as something of a modern sidekick and partner for Captain America to bounce off of, and would stay a major part of the lore ever since. In the comics, Falcon has a literal falcon Redwing that hangs out with him, since Red Skull gave him the ability to speak to birds, kind of like the Aquaman of birds, I suppose. He also tricked Falcon and Captain America to start working together, but they became real friends and partners, with Falcon taking up Captain America's identity in Captain America Volume 7, number 25 in 2014. The character in this film is more of a military man than the strange origin from the comics, but the end result is the same. He's Captain America's equally as morally unshakable pal, and the natural replacement for the hero following Steve, since Bucky took the shield for a time but was not interested in doing it long term. Crossbones also first appeared here, though in the film he just goes by Brock Rumlow, taking up Crossbones' identity later, putting the third Captain America film into motion. Here he's critically injured and wants revenge on Captain America. Brock Rumlow was rolled out across the story arc Captain America Bloodstone, but had his first full appearance in Captain America 360, the fourth part of that arc. Sharon Carter is the great niece of Peggy Carter and the love interest of Captain America. In the comics, Sharon Carter is definitely Captain America's main love interest, but in the films, her aunt Peggy was the primary love interest, which left the film adapting her in a weird place, like should Cap bang his ex's great niece? Ultimately, they stepped back from that and made her the power broker down the line, as Endgame saw Cap and Peggy's happy ending, but it was kind of a weird concept that they kind of had to deal with in the MCU. Sharon first appeared in Tales of Suspense 75 from 1966 and has appeared here and there ever since, being fairly important to Captain America's wider lore. Batroc the Leaper first appeared in this film in a minor role fighting Captain America on the private vessel before being caught by S.H.I.E.L.D. In the comics, he goes by Batroc the Leaper and is a Silver Age Captain America villain that also premiered in Tales of Suspense 75 along with Sharon Carter, appearing here and there throughout the years as a minor rogue fighting Captain America, being on the Thunderbolts and more. Not a huge character, but a cool inclusion, though I will say it's a bit disappointing that this film wanted more of a grounded take, robbing us of Batroc and Crossbone's ridiculous costumes from the comics, something Marvel became less shy of as time went on, but alas, whatever. Captain America in this story continues his Man Out of Time arc from the first film in the Avengers, now facing uncertainty around modern espionage and how it affects the people of the world. Cap was against Project Insight from the start. Even before it was proven, S.H.I.E.L.D. was compromised by Alexander Pierce, and Hydra making the weapon as a way to kill enemies of that organization and commandeer the political landscape. And to this, the rise of a new villain, the Winter Soldier, who proves not only to be his match, but also a brain-controlled and mind-wiped version of his best friend Bucky from back in the war days. Something Steve is having a hard time coming to grips with naturally, and making his existence in the modern day just a bit more complicated. Roger's friends are all dead, and his love life is something that has kind of gone to the wayside. They set up a slight romance with Sharon Carter and Black Widow, but neither pan out in any meaningful way. He does befriend Sam Wilson, and the duo head off to see if Cap's other best friend Bucky can be saved at the end of the movie, hoping to bring him back to his former self. Falcon, or Sam Wilson, is a veteran that crosses paths with Captain America and proves to be a strong guy with a good heart, mirroring Steve himself, which leads him to befriending Steve and eventually get wrapped into all this Avengers business down the line. The film was made before Falcon had become Captain America in the comics, but the film actually sets him up as the natural replacement for Steve's Captain America by the end of the film, which I think was good for the character's long-term story arc and worked out beautifully. This is also an arc almost solely covered by the Russos up until the Falcon and the Winter Soldier TV show, which I think made his ascension from Cap's sidekick to his replacement more meaningful and purposeful. Not sure if it was a note passed down from Marvel Studios or the comics division, or a happy accident to make him Captain America in the comics, but it worked well as a start to his arc, and now we're going to see a film with him starring as the titular Captain America, which could be kind of interesting. Nick Fury fakes his death in this film, following him learning that S.H.I.E.L.D. was compromised. I think this was a solid arc for Fury, and also let Marvel use the character more infrequently, which I think was smart from a narrative sense, but also from the sense that Sam Jackson probably wasn't cheap to get for literally every MCU film the way they had in Phase 1. He starts, following the Battle of New York, believing that S.H.I.E.L.D. should exercise more power to keep the world from dipping into disaster again, an obsession that brings him to approving Project Insight. By the end, he sees no single man or entity can have all that power due to the Hydra takeover, and changes his ways a little bit, going underground. Black Widow, following the Avengers, hasn't changed much. She's still the same spy with a past she regrets, and she wants to help Steve and Nick get out of the situation they found themselves in. She does initially always follow orders, but in the end realizes that doing that for S.H.I.E.L.D. or perhaps Hydra, she may have been doing the same evil deeds that she was doing for the Russians, just under a different banner, so she leaves by the end to find her independence and causes she believes in to fight for. Alexander Pierce and the various other S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and politicians from past entries that have returned have been compromised by Hydra and want to see through their new directive to take over the world through a simmering plan to conquer the world and basically hold it hostage by being able to easily target and neutralize anyone with Project Insight before eventually being stopped by Captain America. They're not too deep. Winter Soldier is the return of Bucky, and definitely isn't too deep of a character in this one. He's a brainwashed assassin who's ruthless and lacks any memory of his past life. Eventually, his friend Steve awakens something in him, bringing him back some recognition of the past, which causes him to run off to deprogram himself, also notably saving Steve's life in the climax, showing he still has some of the good man Bucky once was deep inside him. Tonally, this film kind of apes off James Bond a bit, but is a bit darker than classic Bond and a bit brighter than the Daniel Craig run. To non-Bond fans, what I mean is, there's death and destruction and more, but not as much nihilism with something of a happy ending. It very much wants to leave an optimistic enough ending for the film, so it never feels too hopeless, and a lot of it's kind of brushed under the rug by his next appearance in Avengers Age of Ultron anyways. Cap's faith is unshaken at the core of his character despite some new lingering doubts against the government, so it is MCU dark, but not really dark in the way some films can be. The music was done by Henry Jackson and is fitting but not all that memorable. It kind of has like an industrial spy feel mixed in with some film score. That said, I don't think the music is bad or even that bland. It's just not a classic by any means musically, but I think it's pretty fitting for the most part, and I don't actually have a problem with it. Like, some of the music I think is actively subpar in this phase, and this is just kind of fine and fitting, whatever. Jeffrey Ford returns from Iron Man 3 to edit this film along with Matthew Schmidt, who edited on Iron Man 3 as well as the assistant to Jeffrey Ford, but moved up to a lead on this film. He's done lots of Marvel films and was the lead editor on the upcoming Captain America Brave New World film. This movie is pretty well done. I think the pacing is really solid, and the less CGI heavy action of the film comes together really clean and well done. The CGI is also really well done when it's needed, despite aging a bit over the past decade. Still pretty solid, and I think a film like this with so many moving parts could have felt bloated and dull, but even with a runtime of about 2 hours and 15 minutes, it uses its time very well and comes together pretty clean. Cinematography for this film was handled by Trent Oploch, who is known for working with the Russo brothers and Neil Blomkamp on films like District 9. I think he's probably my favorite cinematographer of the MCU, doing this film, Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. Visually, I think he actually worked very hard to do interesting things in these films. There are still some boring lighting at points and some house style stuff that's kind of mandated, but especially down the line with his Avengers films, this man really cooked up some nice looking shots to kind of pump up the volume a bit from some of the more bland looking entries like the early phase 1 ones. Also, working with Neil Blomkamp was probably a good place to start, proving he could mix CGI with natural sets with relative ease. The film had 2 stingers, one mid-credits scene and one end-credits scene. The mid-credits scene sees Baron Strucker cameo before his first full appearance in a scene where he examines Wanda and Pedro Maximoff, who are in an experimental facility testing their new powers. This is a sting that ties directly into Avengers Age of Ultron and sets up some characters that would go on to be in this film. I remember thinking that was pretty interesting back in the day, especially since Pedro was also currently being run in the X-Men films in a very different take as Quicksilver. The second scene shows Bucky at the Smithsonian looking at some Captain America stuff where he sees his own memorial. This of course teases that the Winter Soldier starts leaning into who he is and working with Captain America again down the line. This film has really fun action. I'm always going to be more of a hand-to-hand combat guy when it comes to movie fight scenes. I think it's easier to connect with the conflict when it's just some people beating the shit out of each other over CGI lasers and shit. I don't know what Loki's laser beam feels like, but I can surmise what a punch from Captain America feels like. The cinematography, choreography, and editing are top-notch in these scenes, and it all comes together very well to make some memorable fight scenes that a lot of Marvel fans still talk about to this day. The elevator fight and Cap's fight with Batak the Leaper are highlights for me, definitely. On top of that, the Nick Fury and Winter Soldier car chase was just awesome. Very Bondish, which I think is definitely an influence, and it was well paced with cool setups like Bucky's frisbee bombs. So cool. I also like that Marvel started referencing things in deep production, like a passing reference to Doctor Strange, who would be training as a sorcerer around this time, despite his film not really being very far in development at this point. Also, Captain America had to have a new cast largely. Some missed, like Sharon Carter, who I think they failed to find a non-eyebrow raising use for, but like Sam was put in a good spot and had a solid setup to go from just some soldier at the start of this film to Captain America later on in the MCU. Zola as a supercomputer was a creative way to attempt to adapt him into the film, and that sequence looked really cool in my opinion. Kind of reminds me of Severance, a show that came out years later that if you haven't seen that show, you should just watch it. This film gets Captain America really well. Captain America's call to arms for all non-Hydra SHIELD members to run into battle is a seminal Captain America type monologue.
If you launch those helicarriers today, Hydra will be able to kill anyone that stands in their way. Unless we stop them.
And I really like the balance of optimism and skepticism on display, along with an unshakable hope for the future. And overall, I really just enjoy this one. I think this film was kind of the turning point in quality in the MCU, where I think Phase 2 and the creatives were in their zone, and it seemed, despite the lukewarm reception of Thor 2, the creatives could do no wrong, something I think would only be compounded with the next film, the surprise hit of Guardians of the Galaxy, proving next to no brand recognition beyond the MCU logo would still prove to be a successful gamble, at least for the time. Captain America the Winter Soldier made a very strong $715 million off of a budget of $175-ish million, a very healthy profit, especially when considering the future insane budgets these movies would employ. It wasn't a billion-dollar movie, but it was a very solid haul. The film also killed it critically with a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes and a respectable 70 out of 100 on Metacritic. These are both very solid scores and prove that the Russos could handle a large budget well and also create films that would connect well with critics and audiences alike and sell a lot of tickets, a reputation that would later allow the pair to make their 3 following movies in this franchise, and some of the most ambitious in the whole of the MCU and I guess cinema in general. Guardians of the Galaxy is a film I was a bit unsure of walking into it. I was a huge comic fan since I was young, but admittedly I had never known much about this team besides a passing knowledge of Rocket Raccoon from videos talking about Marvel's strange talking raccoon. That said, I think there was a lot of anticipation in the air for the then upcoming Star Wars The Force Awakens film, so for me, I figured we would at least get a taste of some goofy sci-fi while we waited. However, I think, like pretty much anyone else who is even marginally a fan of Marvel properties, I was sold on James Gunn's new quirky take on this borderline unknown team that had very little to actually scrape off of, because even at that time, this was a new iteration of the characters, with the team starting as Star-Lord's Kree Squad in 2007 during the Annihilation event, then officially as the Guardians of the Galaxy and Guardians of the Galaxy 1 from May of 2008. Regardless, we'll talk more about that later, but Marvel took a big risk and it definitely paid off, with the franchise becoming one of Marvel's most popular franchises of recent years, as evident by the fact that you can buy Guardians of the Galaxy shampoo, toothpaste, and cereal, with entries being fairly sporadic since this film's release in 2014. Not many characters get that kind of hype that they're able to maintain even at points when their film series are on hiatus, other than superheroes that are pop culture icons like Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man. In 2010, Kevin Feige started kicking around the idea of some more obscure properties coming to the MCU, citing the recent Guardians of the Galaxy revamp as something that interested him. Following this, he said he wanted to take the MCU cosmic and have multiple coalescing universes, so to speak, that would culminate in a potential future film. By 2012, though, it was officially announced, with the team's lineup being announced as Star-Lord, Rocket Raccoon, Groot, Drax, and Gamora. James Gunn, who ultimately got the project, pitched against other directors like Peyton Reed, who would eventually do the Ant-Man trilogy, and Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, who would eventually direct the first Captain Marvel film. Around this time, Joss Whedon signed on as creative consultant for Phase 2 so that he could design a trajectory to his own Avengers sequel, Avengers Age of Ultron. Joss would exit the MCU proper after Phase 2 to go to the competitors at DC in a very ill-fated attempt at the Justice League. You can see my retrospective on that film on my channel. But all this is to say that Joss actually really backed Gunn and thought his vision was awesome, leading to the director's big break in the superhero genre. Nicole Perlman was working with Marvel in a screenwriting boot camp they had to develop talent, and would lead her to writing the concepts of Guardians, writing almost a dozen drafts between 2009 and 2011, even considering doing her take on the original Guardians before moving to the revamped version. Star-Lord would be revamped into a pseudo Han Solo character, and she thought using old pop music would be a good play for the film. Her draft, however, was pretty much gutted when James Gunn joined the project, with Gunn creating a wholly new story. Some of the characteristics of the characters were remixed, and he added the Walkman as an emotional center to the story. The story starts on the death of Peter Quill, or Star-Lord's mother, who dies of cancer as Peter runs off unsure how to process his emotions, but as he flees the hospital, he's abducted by a spaceship. Years later, Quill sets out to steal a mysterious orb, which just so happens to contain the Power Stone, one of Thanos' Infinity Stones that he needs for his plans. So Thanos sends Ronan the Accuser and his daughters Gamora and Nebula after the artifact. Korath the Pursuer confronts Peter, but Peter manages to escape, hoping to sell the orb, not knowing what is inside, on the planet Xander. This is when he's confronted by Gamora, who takes the orb, and a chase ensues that leads them running into a pair of strange bounty hunters, Rocket and Groot.
Quit smiling, you idiot. You're supposed to be a professional.
Who manage to capture them for a second before the Nova Corps shows up and brings them to jail. Peter quickly makes an alliance with the other three people he was put in there with, since it turns out the orb is worth a lot of money to certain people due to its power. Gamora, however, is captured in jail and brought to Drax, who wants to kill her due to her allegiance with Thanos and Ronan the Accuser. However, Gamora says she can bring him to Ronan, and like that, Drax decides to join the team. The group stage a breakout and manage to run off, while Thanos learns of Gamora's defection and orders Nebula and Ronan to track her down and deal with her, and retrieve the Power Stone.
And apparently, you alienated my favorite daughter, Gamora.
The group heads to nowhere to meet the Collector, who they give the stone to, but one of his servants activates it to try to break out of captivity, blowing up the Collector's collection. Gamora steals the stone, and the group finally decide to give the stone to the Nova Corps, but just then Ronan shows up and attempts to capture the stone for Thanos himself. Nebula manages to take the stone, but in the process the Guardians escape from nowhere. The group formally agrees to take care of Ronan and save the stone.
I will fight beside you. And in the end, see my wife and daughter again.
With them asking Yondu and the Ravengers for help in getting the orb. Yondu agrees, assuming he gets to keep the orb, and they also get the Nova Corps to agree to assist. Ronan's ship arrives on Xander, and the three factions attempt to stop Ronan and his fleet, but they know that if Ronan can touch down and start messing with stuff from the ground, it could spell an end to Xander with the Power Stone in his possession. The team eventually makes it onto Ronan's ship, as many of the Ravengers and Nova Corps members start being laid to waste. The group confronts Ronan, and the villain is seemingly killed after Rocket crashes a ship into him. The Dark Aster, Ronan's ship, starts free-falling to the surface, and Groot sacrifices himself to protect his new friends. Ronan, however, is on the ground waiting for them, and the group do a Hail Mary attempt to harness the power of the stone, and to everyone's amazement, Quill is able to survive using it, despite him seemingly being immortal. Along with the other Guardians, he manages to destroy Ronan. Peter gives Yondu the orb, though it lacks the stone, and despite being had, Yondu takes some satisfaction knowing he raised Peter to be a hero in his own twisted way. The Nova Corps thanks the team and fixes their ship. The team take off, learning of reports that Peter's father is not actually human, but actually a strange alien, and the group head off officially as the Guardians of the Galaxy. Groot also has started to regrow after Rocket planted part of his friend, with Baby Groot dancing to some Jackson 5 tunes to close out the film. The Guardians of the Galaxy first appeared in Marvel Superheroes number 18 from 1968, though this is technically a version from another Earth, Earth 691, with the main universe versions of the characters being what this is mainly based on. As I said earlier, the team was piloted with Annihilation Conquest Star-Lord 1, but was later officially formed with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 Number 1 from 2008. The team from that book was slightly different, with all the members from the film being on the comic team, along with Mantis, Adam Warlock, and Quasar. The team has kind of had a rough time figuring out what direction it's going to go in the comics, with lots of odd members added over the years like Captain Marvel, Hercules, Super Skrull, Angela, a character from Spawn who got bought by Marvel in a confusing, weird thing, Ant-Man, Beta Ray Bill, Doctor Doom, Iron Man, Kitty Pryde, The Thing, and Venom. I feel like Marvel never really found out how to take these characters and make a successful long-running comic with them. This isn't even to mention the offshoots like the Asgardians of the Galaxy, the Dark Guardians, etc. Peter Quill first appeared in the comics in Marvel Preview number 4 from 1975 as kind of a Flash Gordon character, or perhaps reminiscent of a character like DC's Adam Strange. It wouldn't be till nearly 3 decades later that the character would reemerge in Thanos 8 from 2004. The character would lead the Guardians of the Galaxy in the comics as well, but is a bit more deadpan in his early history than he is in the film, with Chris Pratt's take having a bit of a lovable goofball feel, something Chris Pratt used a lot coming up in TV shows like Parks and Recreations, and moving forward with the Lego Movie, Super Mario, and Garfield. I don't know. Gamora first appeared in Strange Tales 180 from 1975 and has been most well known as being part of Thanos' house, as his foster daughter, and later as a Guardians of the Galaxy member. She is more or less accurate to the comics. Drax first appeared in Iron Man 55 from 1972 as somewhat of a strange superhero side character for Iron Man. In the film, he's from a planet called Mount Kylos, though in the comics he's a human named Arthur Douglas who was driving from LA to Las Vegas, and when in the desert between the two cities, Thanos basically just passed by and killed his family for fun. Then the origin gets weird. He gets his consciousness and soul put into a body made out of dirt, which causes him to come to life as Drax by an Eternal. Anyways, the film cut all that crap and just made him some dude mad at Ronan for killing his family, just to kind of simplify things and explain why he is where he is. Groot as a concept kind of sort of originated in Tales to Astonish 13 from 1960, and as the cover said, he's the monster from Planet X. Groot's name actually derives from the old Marvel trope of just writing nonsense on comic book covers that kind of looks cool. It was something Stan Lee and his brother Larry Lieber did with Jack Kirby in the time before the superhero revival of the 1960s at Timely. For example, in Tales to Astonish 9, a Godzilla-like monster named Jeroom the Living Lizard was created, Gorgilla the giant gorilla from issue 12, Thor with 2 R's from issue 16, or Moomba from issue 23. The first 34 issues of the title, pretty much every issue would be like that until Ant-Man took over the book, and it was a strange book at the time. The Groot we all know and love, though, first appeared in Annihilation Conquest Star-Lord number 1 and was created by the Gardener along with his Groot brothers. Rocket Raccoon was created in Incredible Hulk 271, and he was a gun-toting raccoon that could talk. That is what he is in the film too. The origin is a bit different, but the idea is similar. Ronan the Accuser, or just Ronan, is a Kree executioner who kills people with a big hammer, pretty much unchanged for this film. The character originated in Fantastic Four 65 from 1967, and he would fight people like the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and the Inhumans, and then occasionally the Guardians of the Galaxy later on. Yondu started off as a founding member of the original Guardians of the Galaxy from the 29th century, appearing in the team's first appearance in Marvel Superheroes number 18. This version from the film is somewhat of an original take, with Yondu in the comics basically being a Guardians version of Captain America leading the Guardians of the Galaxy. That said, this version would later be adapted into the comics in Star-Lord number 1 from 2015, being a character that is an ancestor long removed from the original character, and is more reminiscent of the version we see in the film being a gruff leader of the Ravengers. Are you tired of me explaining characters yet? Well, strap in, here's some more. Nebula first appeared in Avengers 257 from 1985, being the sister of Gamora, kind of her niece though too. It's weird. She was the granddaughter of Thanos, but was later adopted by him. She would be more evil for much of her history, again like Gamora though, she's fairly accurate here. Korth the Pursuer works with Ronan and was the character that works in Kree circles. Korath first appeared in Quasar 32 from 1991. Quasar was always my least favorite Marvel comic. I had a bunch of these in a quarter bin, just straight trash, nothing too exciting here, but he appeared here as well. Roman Day, the goofy Nova guy played by John C. Reilly, was the original Nova Prime, which is the leader of the Nova Corps from their first appearance in Nova number 1 from 1976. He would choose Richard Rider, the original Nova, and gave him his power. The Nova Corps is more or less DC's Green Lantern Corps, but most of them aren't super powerful. I think this was just kind of hinting at Nova proper showing up in the MCU at some point, but to this day that is yet to fully come to fruition. The Collector first appeared in this film following an end credits scene in Thor the Dark World. In the comics, he first appeared as a background character in Avengers 26, before a full appearance in Avengers 28 from 1966. The Collector is an ancient god that, well, collects things. That really doesn't change between the films and the comics, though the character started as an antagonist before becoming a supporting neutral party. Cosmo the Dog was another cameo, first appearing in Nova Volume 4 number 8 from 2007. It was a blink and you miss it cameo, but he's a dog. Howard the Duck briefly appeared in cameos and is most well known at this point for his really shitty movie from the 1980s. But the character was actually kind of a fan favorite for a good minute back in the 70s and 80s after first appearing in Fear 19 with a full first appearance in Man-Thing number 1 from 1973. Thanos has his first full appearance in films here. It's not too deep, but he shows up. The character first appeared in Iron Man 55 from 1972 and would go on to be a major player and antagonist for the larger Marvel Universe. He is really only here to further explain the concept of Infinity Stones and to have a reason for Gamora and Nebula to be in the plot of this film, though the seeds are starting to grow a bit for what the climax of the Infinity Saga would be down the line when he's the villain of Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Star-Lord was the lead in this film, and following his mother's death joined the Ravengers, which was led by Yondu and is sort of the Proto-Guardians but perhaps a little scummier. Following his mission to steal the orb, Peter finally gets his chance at having his own team that eventually evolves into his sort of new family to help fill the large void in his heart left by the death of his mother and the fact that he never knew his father. As this trilogy goes on, the idea of family and Peter's relationship with others is explored further than it was here, but that longing and loneliness in Peter's life, who grew up around a pack of savage, if deep down not the most evil, bandits, is something he tries to work through.
Billions of people will perish.
Is that what you've been filling your head with, boy? Sentiment? Eating away your brain like maggots?
Something I think has a hopeful outlook following the Guardians' victory and ascension into the wider universe after defeating Ronan and his evil army. This film also starts building Peter's romance with Gamora, a love that is much truer than man-slut Peter is perhaps used to having. Speaking of Gamora, she's the daughter of Thanos, who ultimately joins the Guardians, seeing that they're assets to help her defend and hide the orb, knowing her adoptive father would be able to use the orb and the Power Stone to cause massive amounts of destruction if it fell into his hands, or more specifically his gauntlet. Her relationship with Peter doesn't go far in this film, but her heart of stone from the first act of this film starts cracking a bit towards the end. Nebula is the muscle in this movie. Not literally, she's actually quite small, but she's still a deadly threat and less confident in her morals than Gamora, and is a puppet of her adopted father Thanos. She gains more confidence and importance to the story of Guardians of the Galaxy as the MCU continues to unfold, but here she's in this film to be the heavy or the mini-boss, if you know what I'm saying. Drax joins the Guardians, last of the whole team, joining up on the prison satellite. Drax is on a quest to avenge his family since Ronan killed them. Ronan says he doesn't recall them having killed so many people in his years, a contrast to Drax, who has dedicated his life to killing Ronan.
I don't recall killing your family. I doubt I'll remember killing you either.
It isn't until he and the Guardians unite that he finally sees vengeance, gaining a new family that accepts his odd quirks in the process, though it seems his thirst for vengeance can't be fully quelled with him mentioning Thanos is next at the end of the film. He's a goofball. Love this character. Rocket Raccoon, or just Rocket, is a psychopath gun-toting raccoon. He compensates heavily for a lonely and sad past that isn't explained until Guardians of the Galaxy 3, but there's an obvious level of trust he places on no one but his buddy Groot until he meets this group of odd characters and he finds himself entangled with their world and eventually starts trusting them. Groot is Rocket's best friend and sort of the Guardians of the Galaxy's equivalent to Chewbacca from Star Wars, a non-English speaking muscle who is loyal to the end and even sacrifices his own life to protect his best friend Rocket and his new friends he made during the journey. Like the Triratopus dorni, or the immortal jellyfish, Rocket was able to plant a Groot stick who asexually created a clone of himself. A happy, tear-welling ending. I didn't cry, but come on, how can you not come close? It's a cute-ass ending. Ronan is the villain, and while he's big and brooding and scary, with a unique design, I won't lie and say he's all that deep. He's just a super big power hammer wielding warlord that acts as an enforcer for the ultra powerful Thanos. That said, I thought it was cool when Drax wanted him dead and Ronan is like, who the hell are you? It just shows a scale to Ronan's power and crimes that makes some real stakes and makes this villain feel like he's really lived some shit, despite not being the most well laid out character. I think he's just a tad flat like a lot of these Marvel villains, but he's cool, he's threatening. Yondu is the final character I want to talk about. He's Peter's adoptive parental figure, though he came over Peter through villainous means, kidnapping the boy from Peter's father, then growing fond of the boy, making him a scoundrel like him and his pirate crew. Yondu proves to have something of a heart, though. He collects some trinkets, and after learning Peter gave him the orb empty and kept the Infinity Stone to give to Nova Prime, he was proud of his boy taking some of his, thievish, awful traits and using them for good. When I went into this film, I was hoping that the film would quench my thirst for the Star Wars franchise that had been dry as a bone theatrically since Revenge of the Sith, minus that bad Clone Wars film that was a pilot for the good Clone Wars TV show. And in a way, it did quench that thirst, but at the same time, this space opera, while definitely having Star Wars quirks and the tonal balance of fun and darkness that made the original trilogy so unique, it had its own perks, making it very unique and not feel very Star Wars-ish. Creatively, with the properties of the Marvel Universe and the diversity of themes it could take, tying into the Avengers franchise, all made it feel unique, while also having a unique look at the things that made Star Wars so great. What we got wasn't Star Wars, it was kind of the Marvel equivalent though. And while that could be obnoxious and weird in the wrong hands, James Gunn proved to be the man to bring such a story to life for us to view. Tonally, it just feels so unique, intimate, funny, and heartwarming, and it is sort of the best of both worlds, boiled into a fun, crazy action film. The score was done by Tyler Bates, known for working with Zack Snyder a lot, but also working on that movie Zack Snyder did with James Gunn, the Dawn of the Dead remake. The score is fun, but not spectacular, the main attraction being the tie-in album, or Awesome Mix Volume 1, a plot device in the movie they also turned into a merchandised album. Featuring no original songs, only a jukebox of 70s pop hits, including, in numerical order, Hooked on a Feeling by Blue Swede, Go All the Way by the Raspberries, Spirit in the Sky by Norman Greenbaum, Moon Age Daydream by David Bowie, Fooled Around and Fell in Love by Elvin Bishop, I'm Not in Love by 10cc, I Want You Back by the Jackson 5, Come and Get Your Love by Redbone, Cherry Bomb by the Runaways, Escape the Pina Colada Song by Rupert Holmes, Ooh Child by Five Stair Steps, and Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. It's a great album, end-to-end bangers. I had this album in my first car as a teenager in the small local theater a friend of mine worked at, with his now wife, would run this soundtrack exclusively during their hours of operations. Possibly the only CD they had there, but it was all bangers, so I probably have more nostalgia listening to this mixtape of 70s hits, adding up the marquee and posters with my friend or just smoking pot in the theater, than I actually did with it in the film proper, though I already liked it quite a bit. Those were some good times. This film had 3 editors, Fred Raskin, known for working heavily with James Gunn and Quentin Tarantino, training under Tarantino's original editor, the late and great Sally Menke, Craig Wood, who works all over Hollywood for giant franchises like, well, Guardians, but also Pirates of the Caribbean, and most recently Kraven the Hunter. Finally, Hugh Winborn, who worked all over Hollywood, though his output slowed over the years, had been working since the late 80s. The editing is always good, tremendous action editing, and the CGI is well integrated with the live action. Nothing really new to say here for the MCU, but it was a solid team working on this film and made it into what it became and did a good job. Ben Davis did the cinematography on this movie, known for movies like Kick-Ass, Layer Cake, Doctor Strange, and Kraven the Hunter. Apparently that film was sniping a lot of talent from this one. Though, to Davis's credit, this film looks pretty good. I will say that it's very CGI heavy, so it's hard to say what is post-color correction and effects work, but the lighting and shot composition is unique from the cookie-cutter Avengers franchise style. This style, however, would get a bit more boring as time went on, and any cosmic projects in the MCU started using this look, but at the time it was unique, and I won't take that away from Davis. It is visually appealing, and I enjoy how it looks, despite the fact that Marvel might have kind of beat this horse a little too hard in recent years. The end credits show the return of Groot in a scene where Baby Groot, the proto-Baby Yoda, dances to I Want You Back by the Jackson 5. It's cute and adds to the hopeful ending, teasing that Groot, a soon-to-be fan favorite, would indeed be back for more adventures with the Guardians in his new form. The second shows the Collector sulking about his destroyed collection, with Howard the Duck making a gag appearance after Cosmo licks the Collector's face. It's cute like the other scene. Neither really show any crazy cliffhangers, but I like these. I almost prefer this type of end credits scene anyhow to the more like, here's 2 seconds of whatever character's gonna show up in the next movie. Guardians of the Galaxy is a very good film and made James Gunn a named director who would eventually elevate his career to creatively heading the DCEU, the upcoming reboot of the DCEU, starting with his own Creature Commandos TV show and going into his film reboot of Superman. Guardians is a weird mix of being a unique and derivative space opera, taking tropes people loved, remixing them, and seeing James Gunn make them his own. This film would lay the basis for Gunn to become the next hotshot filmmaker that seems to never miss and just constantly has an eye for elevating these superhero films to higher, more human levels than many filmmakers manage to. Becoming an asset to Marvel till he wasn't, but I guess his tale of being cancelled upwards is more of a story for Guardians 3's development, so we'll come back to that eventually. Probably not anytime super soon though. So, just be patient for now. Guardians of the Galaxy, this random little movie about some obscure characters, made $773 million off of a budget of $232 million. The budget is definitely over what was intended, but considering this is the genesis for the Guardians as a merch-selling giant, it was probably well worth the additional cost. Plus, almost $800 million on a film starring a bunch of goofy, unknown characters is almost unthinkable. To put that in perspective, Captain America the Winter Soldier made less at $717 million, about $55 million less than this film, just showing the power of word of mouth and the MCU brand as it kept gaining popularity and strength, film over film. It's almost unthinkable how well this film performed back in the day. On Rotten Tomatoes, this film did well, with a 92 out of 100, and Metacritic giving it a 76 out of 100, being incredibly well received for a film in this genre. The film was nominated for 2 minor Oscars, but 82 total awards across recognized award shows, 22 of which it took home. Basically, it wasn't considered the film of the year, but it did very well, and naturally led to the Guardians of the Galaxy to have a place chiseled for it in wider pop culture and the Marvel Cinematic Universe cycle. The first Avengers film was a smash sensation in 2012 and led to the popularity of the MCU to grow massively. It was only natural that Marvel would continue these films as accumulations of storylines set up in Phase 2, hence Avengers Age of Ultron. Avengers Age of Ultron was a disappointing film for me when I saw it on opening day back in 2015. It was also the first film in the MCU Aiden and I reviewed for this channel back then with one of our drunk views. Our primary complaint at the time was that it was too quippy, and perhaps the fact that I was 16 when this film dropped meant I had no patience for all that.
Shit! Language!
I was growing out of the MCU a bit at that time. Now at 26, I have a different philosophy on the film. Do I think it's bad today? No. Do I think it's an improvement over the first film? Yeah, in ways. Though today I still think I can't bring myself to call it wholeheartedly good. In 2011, Kevin Feige announced a plan that was in place for Phase 2, something that would start with Iron Man 3 and end with the second Avengers film. That wouldn't exactly be how it ended up going down though, as Ant-Man is still considered Phase 2, with Phase 3 starting on Captain America Civil War. Joss Whedon was pretty much implied to take on the second Avengers film, with him initially pitching the idea of a smaller film than the first, but the scope continued to grow, causing it to basically be on par, but notably much more expensive, costing north of $400 million to create, being one of the most expensive films ever created. I guess so much for the concept of it being cheap. Initially, it wasn't a given, though, that Robert Downey Jr. would return, with his initial 4-film contract being fulfilled following Iron Man 3. However, he decided to come back due to the magic of money, hence them ending Tony's arc following Iron Man 3, then reopening Tony's arc again here. Also, hence why Robert Downey Jr. is set to star as Doctor Doom in the upcoming Avengers films. Joss Whedon, in writing this film, supposedly looked at films like The Empire Strikes Back and The Godfather 2 for inspiration, but fucking how? I'm not going to entertain this anecdote further because I don't see it at all. I just think it's something that any director of a film sequel says, since those are considered two of the few sequels that famously meet or surpass the first film. If I had $1 every time someone said this, I would be a rich man. This happens all the time in Hollywood. It's typically to be totally ignored. Regardless, Captain Marvel was considered to appear, though since she wasn't casted and there was already a lot of new characters in this film, they passed on that in favor of adding Vision, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver. Quicksilver definitely being the most interesting addition to the cast, given that he was at the time part of the cast of the X-Men films over at Fox. It was some weird stuff with the odd and vague rights that Marvel handed over to the studios back in the day when they were outsourcing their film productions rather than doing them in-house. Quicksilver was one of the classic Avengers and was arguably more of an Avengers character around his creation, being on the second iteration of the team for quite a while before becoming more of an X-Men character, again, along with his sister Scarlet Witch. It's odd, and we'll talk about it a bit more later in this video. The early draft also had a hint towards the Planet Hulk storyline as adapted in Thor Ragnarok later on. This was not shown as they didn't want to put too much speculation that was the team's intention. The story behind why that was a Thor film plot and not, a Hulk plot is a story for when we cover that film down the line. But the gist is, as always, rights issues. Ultron was pretty quickly picked by Whedon to be the villain of this film as one of his favorite Avengers villains. Though with Tony Stark and Hulk on the team, Joss figured adding Hank Pym, Ultron's creator in the comics, to the story would be too much science talk for the audience. Not to mention Ant-Man was a character under production by Edgar Wright at the time, so he didn't want to step on any toes and decided to just make Ultron the creation of Tony and Bruce in the film. The film would cast James Spader as Ultron, Elizabeth Olsen, at the time the third Olsen sister that wasn't in the Olsen twins, who's now probably equally famous to them, and Aaron Taylor Johnson as Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch respectively. This was Aaron Taylor Johnson's second superhero role after playing Kick-Ass in the film Kick-Ass 5 years earlier. Ironically, Kick-Ass's best friend in that film would be played by Evan Peters, who was playing Quicksilver over at Fox during this film's production. So if you want to see another superhero film starring both versions of Quicksilver that also happens to loosely be a Marvel film, but by neither Fox nor Disney, you can watch Kick-Ass. That is certainly a story for another time, even more convoluted than this one. Though other than that, Paul Bettany would be upgraded from playing a voice role as Jarvis, as he had since Iron Man, into playing the Vision. Don Cheadle would appear as Rhodey in a brief appearance. Otherwise, the principal cast from the original Avengers would be back in its entirety, and that would round out the cast. The film began shooting in February 2014 for a May 2015 release, 3 years following the first entry of the Avengers series. The story starts on the original 6 Avengers on a mission to wipe out Hydra remnants following the events of Captain America the Winter Soldier and the group's reemergence since their seeming destruction at the end of World War II. This particular mission leads to the team tracking Baron von Strucker, who has gained possession of Loki's scepter, aka the Tesseract, aka the Cosmic Cube, aka the Mind Stone. Von Strucker is using the scepter to create new powerful weapons, as well as attempting to create new superhumans, with his subjects Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver attacking the Avengers. Iron Man secures the scepter, but his mind is attacked by Scarlet Witch while Quicksilver is outside, causing the other Avengers issues. Scarlet Witch, however, is shocked by what she sees in Tony's vision, allowing the Avengers to take the scepter while her and her brother flee, and Von Strucker is arrested. Bruce Banner and Tony start looking into the scepter's power, with Tony figuring he could give more sentience to his peacekeeping robots, the Iron Legion, if he used the scepter's powers, a group of robots the Avengers could use as an army if another Loki ever came to Earth or something. However, Tony can't track down how to make the thing work the way he wants, that is, until the Avengers are hosting a party and a nearly destroyed Iron Legion drone attacks the party. The drone identifying himself as Ultron.
Ultron. In the flesh. Or no, not yet.
They capture the scientist, Dr. Cho, and run off with the scepter to an old Hydra base in Sokovia. Ultron recruits the Maximoff twins, with their origin being revealed, showing that their parents were killed by a Stark missile, hence their hatred towards Tony Stark. Wanda, knowing that Stark having the scepter would likely lead to his own undoing. Ultron kills Strucker and lures the Avengers to an arms deal he's holding with Ulysses Claw. The Avengers fight Ultron, with the robot gaining vibranium off of Claw that he stole from Wakanda, leading the villain to now have near invulnerable armor. Wanda infiltrates Bruce Banner's mind, making him Hulk and causing him to rampage through Johannesburg, South Africa, with Iron Man confronting him in his Hulkbuster armor. The fight and resulting damage leads the Avengers to be public enemies, which brings them to Hawkeye's farm, where they meet his wife and kids. Thor decides to leave the movie for a bit.
I saw something in that dream. I need answers. I won't find him here.
And Hulk and Black Widow plan to run off during all this, since they have a slapdash romance. But after Nick Fury shows up on the farm to give the Avengers a rousing speech, Bruce somehow comes up with the idea that Cho was kidnapped by Ultron as a means to get her synthetic skin technology. Okay, I guess. Anyhow, Ultron makes a synthetic body and plans to form it with the Mind Stone, while Cho is under the scepter's influence, though during the upload the twins have a change of heart and interrupt Ultron right as Captain America, Hawkeye, and Black Widow arrive to fight him, figuring that he would be at Cho's lab. The Avengers fight Ultron and grab Cho's machine along with the body inside, and bring it back to Avengers Tower, where Banner and Stark plan to double down and bring the body alive with Jarvis's consciousness or wavelength or whatever, since that would make the robot good. And they found out following Ultron taking over the Iron Legion, Jarvis fled into the internet. I don't know either. Anyhow, the twins try to stop this from happening, along with Captain America, but Thor, who I think we all kind of forgot was even in this movie, comes out of nowhere and brings the Mind Stone to life, creating the Vision. Thor then tells the Avengers about the Infinity Stones, and Vision explains that they need to stop Ultron. The now 9 Avengers head to Sokovia to fight Ultron, who is razing the city of Novigrad, Sokovia's capital, with a ginormous engine he created out of the remaining vibranium and some Chitauri tech he managed to find. Anyways, the Avengers fight the Iron Legion and Ultron on this giant floating city, leading to them, of course, evacuating the thousands of civilians and killing Ultron and the Legion in the process, but at the cost of Quicksilver, who died defending Hawkeye and a couple of children. It's okay though, because Aaron Taylor Johnson would return as Kraven the Hunter in the Sony Cinematic Universe of Marvel villain mockbuster films almost a decade later, so I guess there's some consolation for you guys. This film has a number of new characters as always, so let's take a look, shall we? Quicksilver, or Pedro Maximoff, is fairly similar to his appearance from the comics, being a super speed enhanced superhuman character. With that said, his core differences stem from the character's origins and background. In the comics, Quicksilver first appeared in X-Men issue 4 as a founding member of the Brotherhood of Mutants, ostensibly Magneto's evil X-Men. These days, there are more nuance to them, with it sort of being a Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X thing, and Magneto not being fully evil, kinda sorta, occasionally, depending who's writing him. Regardless, the reason his movie rights weren't fully owned by Fox was because, following a short stint on the Brotherhood, he and Scarlet Witch both left the team and eventually found their way over to the Avengers, being inducted to the team's second iteration, where Wasp, Hulk, Thor, and Iron Man were out, and the twins, along with Captain America, who stayed on the team, and Hawkeye were in. This new micro-Avengers would lead the characters to be both categorized as Avengers and X-Men characters, since the characters were heavily featured in both worlds in the comics. Hence, this version lacked the mutant heritage of the comics and was instead created using the Mind Stone. Scarlet Witch also premiered in X-Men number 4, and much of what I said about Quicksilver still applies here, though where Quicksilver was more of an X-Men focused character later in his history, Scarlet Witch very much stayed on both sides of the coin. Famously, the Marvel event House of M, Wanda screws up the Marvel universe, saying no more mutants, and creates a rip in the timeline. She is very overpowered. In this first film, I feel she's a little undercooked, but later entries in the MCU, like her show WandaVision or Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, add to her character a lot, so we'll talk more about her down the line. Ultron is a super powerful robotic villain that menaces the Avengers constantly, first appearing in Avengers 54 from 1968. The biggest change to Ultron was really his origin story. In the comics, Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, was messing around trying to create a super intelligent robot, succeeding by creating Ultron, who, after gaining sentience off Hank's brain waves, becomes Ultron. Ultron then hypnotized Hank and caused him to forget ever having made the robot. Ultron started building himself upgrades, upgrading himself to Ultron 5 by the time he finally confronted the Avengers for the first time. Ultron still upgrades himself here and there, but you get the idea. He also created the Vision, kind of like he did in this film, but it's a little bit different in the comics. Vision was created in Avengers 57 and is basically the same character from the film again, though with very different origins. Where Ultron just kind of whipped up Vision using Dr. Cho's tech in the film, in the comics, Ultron stole the deactivated body of Jim Hammond, the original Human Torch, who was a cyborg character from the 1940s, most famous for being recycled into the Human Torch character from the Fantastic Four. That character first appeared in Marvel number 1 from 1939, the comic that the company's name is now derived from. Regardless though, later it was retconned to be some clone of Hammond because they wanted to bring back the OG Human Torch or something. Anyways, I wish I was done, but I'm not. Ultron gets Phineas Horton, who created the Human Torch, and gets him to make the thing with him, but this leads to Human Torch's good guy brainwaves being instilled into the Vision, which makes him good. On the side though, Ultron also mixed in Wonder Man's brainwaves, who used to be a villain at first and then became an Avenger. So Vision is more or less Ant-Man's grandson, whose dad is Ultron. He's in the body of the original Human Torch and has the mind of Wonder Man. In the film they just say fuck it, it's Jarvis, and that probably works better if I'm being totally honest. It's a little less convoluted, clearly. Wolfgang von Strucker appeared in this film after cameoing in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. The character first appeared in Sergeant Fury number 5 from 1963 and was a Nazi originally who helps in facilitating the rise of Hydra, at one point even being the group's supreme leader. He would often menace Sergeant Fury before the war comic was discontinued and Nick Fury would take over as the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. The film version is similar. He is a higher up in Hydra that did some experiments with Loki's scepter that caused the creation of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Pretty simple. Ulysses Claw first appeared in Fantastic Four number 53 and was an enemy of Wakanda, hell-bent on taking its supply of animanium. In the comic, he has sonic powers and is literally immortal. In this film, he's just a dude that sells weapons and sells a stash of animanium to Ultron for his new body. The character resurfaces but never gets an absolutely goofy costume like the one he has from the comics, which absolutely sucks. I think this suit would have translated perfectly to the screen. This is notable as an early mention of Black Panther though, who they're kind of foreshadowing for his first appearance in Captain America: Civil War. Friday replaces Jarvis as Tony's suit AI for the suit scenes. Nothing too notable though. Unlike Jarvis, who in the comics is a human butler, Friday in the comics was always an AI assistant that first appeared in Iron Man Volume 3 number 53 from 2003. That was a lot of threes. Might as well mention the notable Iron Man suits here, as we always do. Mark 43 is the suit Tony starts the film with and uses throughout most of its runtime, and is very loosely based on Model 13 from the comics and armor from Iron Man 300 from 1993 that Tony uses to control the Hulkbuster. This appearance isn't quite what the Model 13 is, but the suit works similarly to that model, so that's why I mention it. The Mark 44, or the Hulkbuster armor, was a series of armors, but started as an accessory of Model 13, though in the comics, the Hulkbuster would start as a standalone model for Model 31, and was primarily used to fight the Hulk, obviously. Mark 45 is the final armor, and is basically a standalone armor, and I think it's honestly one of the sleekest worn in the whole MCU. This armor looks pretty neat. Iron Man is definitely the main character in this film, and he is in all the Avengers films, honestly. In this film, Tony is obsessed with protecting the people of the world with his Iron Legion, something he wants to grant more autonomy over, mistakenly causing Ultron to be created, causing conflict between him and the other Avengers. Captain America takes extra offense to these steps in Tony's evolution, since it was a reflection of the helicarrier S.H.I.E.L.D. was creating through Project Insight from Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is basically unmanned and preemptive strikes on targets that the U.S. deems as dangerous.
I'm gonna say this once.
How about nunts?
Shut it down.
Nope, not gonna happen.
You don't know what you're doing.
And you do?
This also moves the rift between those heroes a bit further apart, leading to the events of Captain America Civil War shortly after this film, which we'll obviously come back to in our Phase 3 video. Captain America is basically just here to be mad at Tony and pad out the roster a bit, but this is still an essential role for the wider story of the MCU, as Tony's actions in this film directly leads to him and Tony's battle in Captain America 3, and also sets in motion Captain America's decision to put down the S.H.I.E.L.D. in Avengers Infinity War. Thor is also kind of just here for fights, very underutilized. He briefly leaves the film to have some dark visions of a possible future, but he's not super important in this film, and honestly, if he wasn't in the film, I doubt anyone, including myself, would have really noticed. Hulk is still hulking, which is a problem. As Banner, he lightly takes Tony's side in creating AI as a way to kind of not need to use the Hulk, which would greatly help him be at ease and protect him from causing massive collateral damage and deaths along the way. At one point, he is mind attacked by Scarlet Witch, causing him and Iron Man to fight, something that adds more to the future Sokovia Accords in Civil War, and leads him to jettison off planet, something resolved in Thor Ragnarok a couple years down the line. Hulk, due to his convoluted rights, couldn't get a movie made about him unless it was greenlit by Universal, who would distribute, and Marvel would have to do all the creative footwork, though he could appear in Avengers films without Universal's involvement. This is sort of a similar concept to the Spider-Man deal that's going on with Sony right now, but much less favorable for Universal, especially since Disney's not going to give up distribution for a movie they basically created, and given the fact that they can use Hulk in other films, just not make his own solo film without having to get Universal involved. That is why he gets lots of character progression in these Avengers films over some of the other side characters like Thor. This film tries a romance with Black Widow that ultimately feels rushed, goes nowhere, and was just another attempt at pairing her off with one of the Avengers.
I would have joined you, but it didn't seem like the right time.
Something they really wanted to do to no success throughout these films. It is never really substantially mentioned again in the MCU either. Black Widow is Hulk's support and calming presence. She sort of takes on the Betty role that was vacant since they didn't want to pay Liv Tyler presumably to come back and try to write her into the film as Betty Ross. Otherwise, she's just fight scene fodder. Hawkeye doesn't do much but sits in the background shooting arrows, though he does have a bit of a rivalry throughout the film with Quicksilver, who eventually sacrifices his life for the Archer and some random civilians. On that note, Quicksilver is the first Avenger in the series to die, being killed fighting some Ultron sentries and protecting Hawkeye. He is definitely more fight scene fodder than his sister Scarlet Witch, though his rivalry with Hawkeye is cute and his death is marginally sad, if a bit of a waste given the fact that I think his death wouldn't get much further payoff until WandaVision almost 5 years down the line. Scarlet Witch is evil along with her brother, but mostly because she's mad at Tony Stark for seemingly killing her parents. That said, we eventually learned that was when Obadiah Stane from Iron Man 1 was in charge, hence the sale of the weapon to some shady characters. And following the Battle of Novi Grad in Sokovia, she joins the Avengers. Her mind-influencing powers also occasionally influence the Avengers and cause disturbing visions for Tony Stark at one point, though she's still a tiny bit undercooked in this movie, mostly just being a plot device. Vision is born in this film and is the offspring of Ultron and the Mind Stone. He joins the Avengers and isn't really that important yet, but he comes more into play in the following films. Ultron is the big bad of this film and fights the Avengers, hoping to save the Earth by eradicating humanity and making it a land of machines. He's the product of Iron Man and has a bit of that Tony Stark flair. A lot of quips and shit coming from this guy. He's interesting enough and kind of has the standard comic book Ultron motives. I also think he's an interesting choice for a villain, seeing as the previous film went magical fantasy with Loki, so something that's kind of a futuristic robot menace was kind of a fun contrast to that in my opinion. Tonally, this film is a bit darker than the first, with human experimentation, heartless robotic characters, and more, but still maintains, or perhaps amplifies, the quippy, lighthearted feel of the first Avengers film, which, while being a fan favorite in the first film, comes off a bit eye-rolly here, with Joss at times playing the hits and at times just going a bit too far with the humor, that it sort of undercuts the drama. For example, when they invade the Hydra base at the start of the film, Captain America is reprimanding Iron Man for swearing while they're basically in a battle.
Wait a second. No one else is going to deal with the fact that Cap just said language?
I know.
It's really strange to me and kind of adds a barrier between the dialogue of the film and what the film is actually showing us. If you watch my review of Joss Whedon's Justice League, you'll see this style started to wear on audiences by that film's release, a mere 5 years after the release of the Avengers. So I think both Warner Brothers and Disney, with their respective superhero films, started to kind of tone down that random humor that was so popular in the early 2010s. I think we also see some critics thinking it was a bit overdone even by this time as well. It feels very Reddit karma-esque or Tumblr baiting, where it just wanted to be a thing so bad, but it feels forced and not natural. Like writing in and cooking in improv, where the original feels at least a bit more like the actors hopped off scripts to have some fun and created some interesting jokes. Here, that's not the case as much, and it just feels so forced to try to get fans to relate to it or something. I'm not sure. The music in this film was done by Brian Tyler, with Batman veteran Danny Elfman on support, and it's solid. Lots of music that follows the thesis set up in Alan Silvestri's work from the first film, while adding more industrial feeling tracks for this film, which makes sense given Ultron's the villain. A new version of the Avengers riff shows up, but they save it for the final battle so it isn't overplayed and allows that score to define the characters perfectly without becoming overutilized. Good stuff here. Jeffrey Ford is back editing this after previously editing Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Lisa Lassick joins the team as an editor known for her work with Joss Whedon on the Avengers, Serenity, and the Joss Whedon-produced Cabin in the Woods. The editing is pretty good, as always, quick and snappy, not overly long. I do think this film has some character management issues, which could be a problem with the editing or perhaps the script. Thor, Captain America to an extent, and Quicksilver all feel underutilized to me. I think Quicksilver was mostly added as part of Scarlet Witch's origin, which is fair, but Thor and Captain America were two of the big three Avengers characters who really set up the tone for the team, and they have pretty little going on. Captain America especially could have used a bit more screen time setting up more grievances with Tony to add some motivation to his then upcoming third film, where he and his team of outlaw Avengers goes against Tony and his sanctioned Avengers. It just feels a bit like a missed opportunity to add some more of that arc and set up the next big step for these characters. Ben Davis returned from Guardians of the Galaxy as the cinematographer, and thank God for him. I hate how the first Avengers looks. It's real flat, sterile, and stylist, which is so lame to me. I get the colors are supposed to pop to make it look like a comic, but like, move the fucking camera or something. The movie may be the worst looking movie in the MCU in my opinion. I put cinematography as one of the most important aspects in filmmaking for me as well, since it's a visual medium and I find it to be incredibly important. So with that, it is important to shoot something that doesn't lead to migraines, and this film did a pretty good job of not doing that. It's a bit more grimy, a bit greasy, which is fitting for Ultron, visually darker, and it looks great. The only exception being the Hulkbuster versus Hulk fight, which they threw the cliched it's Africa, so let's throw a piss yellow filter over it. Filmmakers do this a lot with South America as well, and it always looks like ass. Piss yellow should not be a color that films have in their color palettes. It just should not be allowed. Regardless, that is one 7-minute scene, so I can get past it, since the rest of the movie I think is generally appealing visually. This film has so much more personality than the first, and I love that. Ben Davis has a much different style than he did in Guardians of the Galaxy as well, and just to kind of see how he frames these characters against how he frames the Guardians is incredible, and I think it's nice that he has a variety even within the universe of the MCU. The post-credit scene again teases Thanos, this time with Thanos putting on his gauntlet, saying he is annoyed by the lack of progress in attaining the Infinity Stones, so he's going to personally collect them. It's kind of odd though, since no one in this film actually worked for him, and also Thanos looked like ass here. The close-up was just so bad.
I'll do it myself.
Look, it's a bit hokey, but they need to hype up the character, and I appreciate that they saved Thanos till the time is right, rather than having his ass get beat down by a powerless Ant-Man or something like they did with Kang. Thankfully, Jonathan Majors was fired though, so I never have to talk about a shitty Kang-based Avengers movie, but we'll come back to that way down the line, don't worry. We'll get to him. I don't normally talk much about the CGI, since I think story and overall visuals should come over the field of CGI, which solely depends on how much money the studio can toss at it. But this film looks really good. Ultron has a good design, though when he talks it looks a little bit weird.
I'm glad you asked that, because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
I almost would have preferred they just did what they did in the comics, where his face is a hard head, basically, not articulated, then subtle lights showed when the character talked or whatever. I'm sure it was a lot of concept art and stuff that led to the decision to make him have the moving mouth, but it looks a tiny bit weird and uncanny valley. Iron Man's suit is also very CGI heavy in this one. Each film it looks less and less real, since they insert more and more CGI, and it occasionally just looks a bit odd and not real. I sort of wish more elements were still practical, then they just touched it up with CG, but I guess going through multiple suits per film would be much harder if they actually had to do the models. Plus these films have so many moving parts as it is, and so much more happens in camera that it likely would have been such a hassle to do, so I understand, but I still wish it was a little more practical. I thought it was also a tiny bit funny that Hawkeye had a secret family. I think they kind of considered setting up a romance between him and Black Widow, and with Iron Man taken, Thor was taken, and the dynamic with Captain America didn't work. And since they absolutely insisted on giving Black Widow a romance, Hawkeye and Hulk were kind of the options they had. They tried Captain America, but it didn't work out since the vibe was too boring. But then they chose Hulk in an attempt to make Black Widow sort of the superhero version of Betty from the comics, I think. So at that point they had to write Hawkeye out as a romantic possibility, and they just kind of ass-pulled a wife.
Yeah, we would have called ahead, but we were busy having no idea that you existed.
Yeah, well,
Marvel's story team.
help me set this up.
I don't know, seems sort of dumb. It also just sort of wrote Hawkeye out of having anything interesting to happen with him. I think the Russos and the snap from Infinity War added some tension back to Hawkeye, but yeah, it was kind of a weird idea they had here with the whole secret family retcon and the fact that Hawkeye, who constantly interacted with Black Widow in the first film, was kind of backseated since Black Widow's scenes all have to do with the Hulk. Like, what the fuck is he still doing here? Avengers Age of Ultron is okay. The problems with this film boil down to too many quips, the poorly done Hulk Black Widow romance, and just too many characters along with lots of retreading not so long after the first film. The finale feels similar despite it being a flying city this time rather than just the streets of New York. The Avengers run around fighting nameless villains, then they do a dramatic circle up and fight lots of enemies together, then they fight the villain before Hulk beats him down comically hard when he's defeated. It's the exact same formula. On the other hand, though, this film did what the first film did, but better, primarily since it's shot worlds better than the first film, which I think is the X factor that makes me prefer this film just a slight bit over the first. Is it perfect? No. But it's a more watchable version of the concept, despite this film being all but obsolete since the release of Infinity War and Endgame, which are much more refined and less formulaic than these films. Avengers Age of Ultron made a massive $1.4 billion, a decent step up from the first, and that's a lot of money. These films sort of set up the billion-dollar or failure mentality Hollywood would have, which lasted for a solid little while before COVID kind of reset Hollywood's expectations a bit. And with streaming, the revenue sources have switched. Things like stock prices on streaming services and brands, along with ticket sales and streaming numbers, are more the new metrics of success over just hard ticket sales. So this probably won't be the norm again anytime soon, with Phase 2 and Phase 3 definitely being the peak of this franchise in terms of box office hauls, unless Avengers Secret Wars just surprises the hell out of all of us. Along with that, this film costed $440 to $490 million, a budget that is just way too much these days. Again, though, with AI and stuff, I would be shocked if we see these budgets often anymore these days, with, I'm sure, many jobs being cut off the chopping block if they can be fulfilled by computers for cheaper. Regardless, though, Disney wanted to outdo the first film, and that took lots of resources to achieve, with a bigger scope and a bigger cast that was demanding more cash to return to this unprecedented position they found themselves in as pioneers of the MCU, put on pre-MCU as large entity contracts that were a lot less of you signing away 10 appearances, as is basically expected now. The film, despite being looked back on as a weaker entry in the MCU, still did well critically, with a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 66 out of 100 on Metacritic. This would pretty well set up the Avengers for Phase 3, the final phase of this first saga in the MCU, with one more introductory film, Ant-Man, to wrap up the MCU's second phase. The only thing I remember from the first time I saw Ant-Man back in the day is that I was ungodly stoned and for some reason decided to go to the bigger movie theater out of town rather than my local cinema, the Lake 5 Theater, which was sort of a dump, but I could pretty easily walk to it. As I was driving over, I saw a minimum 15 cops on the frontage road that weaved me over there. Thankfully, I made it over okay. From my vague recollection of seeing the film as a teenager, though, I remember thinking it wasn't the worst thing ever, but I just kind of thought it was an alright filler movie before things started to pick back up in Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which was set to launch the following year in 2016. Ant-Man as a concept started up back in the 1980s when Stan Lee tried to convince Roger Corman of New World Pictures to create a movie following the hero, which was so wild to think about, honestly, but at this time, Marvel was pretty much failing, and it was a game of hot potato to see who wanted to save Marvel next, with the company not really gaining sturdy legs till the superhero boom brought on by Blade, X-Men, and Spider-Man in the early 2000s. How different the world would be if Roger Corman made his own Marvel films like Spider-Man vs. Yeti, The Thing vs. the Swamp Creature, Captain America walks around an empty desert for 45 minutes the movie, Daredevil vs. Mega Snake, etc., etc. It would have been crazy. Anyhow, Corman didn't own Marvel for long, and the only thing we got out of it was a strange, scrapped Fantastic Four movie from the 80s that has since leaked online in its entirety. I will review that again eventually, but I made a small video on it a few years back if you want to check it out. Anyways, due to the similar Disney production Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Roger Corman didn't want to make the movie, which seems odd since that man loved exploiting fads, but he knew he couldn't go up against Rick Moranis, so it was scrapped. The concept was put on hold until the year 2000, when Marvel was then sort of independently owned by a venture capitalist company and branched back into its own thing, no longer as a subsidiary. Anyhow, Howard Stern wanted to buy the character of Ant-Man around this time, but that went nowhere, since around this time, Artesian Entertainment, a film production company, got the rights to the character. During this time, however, Edgar Wright, known for films like Scott Pilgrim and Shaun of the Dead, joins the project, penning the script to the superhero comedy film. This is when Scott Lang was decided to be Ant-Man in the film, so they could add some heist elements, which was more Edgar Wright's style than Hank Pym, a wife-beating scientist. Edgar Wright was a longtime Ant-Man fan, apparently owning both Scott Lang and Hank Pym's first appearance in comic form, since he was so fascinated with the character as a child. Regardless, Artesian basically thought the idea sucked and didn't send the script to Marvel. Though in 2004, Lionsgate bought Artesian Entertainment, which voided their Ant-Man deal, and the rights ended up back with Marvel to reshop this project. This is when Edgar Wright and writing partner Joe Cornish would pitch the idea of a goofy comedy action film to Kevin Feige in 2004. It wouldn't go anywhere for a couple years till April of 2006, when Feige would hire Edgar Wright to write and direct, with Joe Cornish working on the film as well. The final version of this film was set to be in Marvel's first slate of independent films, which would eventually be called Phase 1. Edgar Wright would excitedly announce at Comic-Con 2006 that his film would incorporate Scott Lang as Ant-Man with his mentor Hank Pym in a goofy, albeit still dramatic superhero film that wasn't a spoof but was a light-hearted... Wait a second. This film came out in 2015 and was directed by Peyton Reed.
Hey,
NTMA.
this is Ernie Hudson, Winston Zeddemore from, Ghostbusters, Oz, The Anarocks Are Great. Just in a few film and TV shows.
Whoa, what? Ernie Hudson? What are you doing to my show?
Just want to ask you this.
Would you explain why they shit-canned Edgar Wright?
All right, fine, I'll do it.
You see, the problem was Edgar Wright was taking a very long time. The first script was handed in March 2008. Iron Man was pretty much done by the time the first script for Ant-Man was finished. This was before revisions or anything. The film went silent till 2010, when the director said he met with Stan Lee and was still writing the film, with Marvel, now owned by Disney, not in a huge hurry to push the project forward. Later in 2010, the film was confirmed to be releasing at some point after Avengers, which was set for a 2012 release. In 2011, Wright would hand in his third draft, and in 2012, while promoting the Avengers, Kevin Feige said Ant-Man was almost ready to shoot, and Edgar Wright tweeted an image of the character. In June, Edgar Wright presented test footage of Ant-Man to show how the film would look on the screen at Marvel Studios' Comic-Con panel. Critics raved, saying the test footage felt like Edgar Wright's critically acclaimed films like Hot Fuzz or other goofy action comedy dramas, and with all that, the film was revealed to be releasing November 6th, 2015, and everyone could finally see the opus of a superhero film Edgar Wright was making for the past 12 years. Around this time, Paul Rudd became the frontrunner for Hank Pym, who by this draft was the main Ant-Man again. He was chosen, as we know by now, though he would play the Scott Lang version, while Evangelion Lily was casted as the female love interest. Things were finally ready to shoot until they weren't, since Marvel let go of Edgar Wright, with a joint statement coming out that Wright was dropped due to creative differences. The old classic statement that basically means it's none of our damn business. Though what happened has since been elaborated on, with Wright saying that he wanted to make a Marvel film, but Marvel didn't want to make an Edgar Wright film, with Marvel leadership kicking around the idea of taking what Edgar Wright did and sort of separating him from the project he had been writing for the past decade. This made Edgar Wright feel like more of a director for hire, since previously he had written every project he worked on, and it was kind of a non-negotiable point for him. Along with Wright, much of his regular crew he brought with him would also end up leaving the project, with some of his concepts and casting remaining, but his vision and decade and a half of hard work basically thrown out the door. But hey, at least Marvel didn't have to recast or redevelop the project too much. I don't think Edgar Wright's work for hire point may have been too far off though, because Adam McKay, director of Daddy's Home, became a frontrunner along with other comedy film directors, but ultimately the role of director was landed by Peyton Reed, known for films like The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes, Bring It On, Yes Man, Oh, and this really shitty one, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium. Kevin Feige assured fans, though, he'd work Peyton like a racehorse, saying that they were actually moving up the release date from November to July of 2015. The new script started being written with Joe Cornish and Edgar Wright credited, but the final version being written by Adam McKay and Paul Rudd largely. Adam McKay is known for a lot of Will Ferrell comedies like the PS3 original film Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. The film seemed to shoot with ease, though, and was done quickly, with very few road bumps following Edgar Wright's exit. The new team opting to shoot things with macro lenses, then CG Ant-Man into scenes, playing with CGI scale, wanting to avoid the oversized sets of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, a movie that this production spent 20 years trying not to emulate, apparently. Anyways, the story of Ant-Man follows Scott Lang, who is a convicted criminal who's been pulling off impressive cat burglaries for years, though his last one led to him having a stretch in prison, so he missed a portion of his young daughter Cassie's life, and his baby mom, while trying to be very patient with Scott, wants him to get his act together before he comes around Cassie more, as she fears he will cause emotional harm to her. She also has a kind-hearted new husband, who's just kind of a through-and-through stepdad. Regardless, Scott is talked into one last job with his friends to rob an old weirdo scientist, Hank Pym, and they happen into his super suit, which freaks Scott out, though he steals it, while Darren, the man who took over Hank Pym's company and forced him out, is also playing around with the science of shrinking stuff based on Hank's so-called Pym particles. Hank and his daughter Hope decide to bring Scott in to be the new Ant-Man, since Hank is kind of aged out of the role. His daughter Hope is sort of spying on Darren after assisting with the hostile takeover, then realizing that Darren's a bit insane. Scott joins up with the duo, seeing that he has a lot to gain and not really that much to lose in being a superhero and doing a big heist for good. So Scott becomes Ant-Man, and with the help of his old convict friends, hopes to crash a display of Darren's new Pym particles and steal the stuff, though Darren discovers them, causing the plan to go astray. Ant-Man fights Darren, who has taken his own identity as the Yellow Jacket, having a real "my suit's better than yours" moment. And the pair end up fighting at Scott's baby mom's house, with Darren holding Cassie, his daughter, hostage, though the two fight, and at the end of the battle, Scott and Darren start shrinking to subatomic size, heading towards the quantum realm, but before Scott gets lost, he manages to regrow and free himself. The film ends on Scott getting visitation for his daughter, as well as being a full superhero, with the Avengers looking to recruit him after hearing of his exploits, and with a bit of a cosign from Sam Wilson, who he briefly has a run-in during the film. Ant-Man features a few additions to the canon that were notable adaptations from the comics. Hank Pym, or the original Ant-Man, is an old mentor of Scott who has done secret missions as Ant-Man for decades, earlier for S.H.I.E.L.D. as a pseudo-superhero who eventually needs to find a new Ant-Man to stop Darren's evil schemes. In the comics, Hank Pym is a founding member of the Avengers who first appeared in the horror anthology series Tales to Astonish that we talked about more in our Guardians of the Galaxy segment, being just Science Man in issue 27 from 1961, before becoming the hero Ant-Man in issue 35, Giant Man in issue 49, Goliath in Avengers 28, Yellow Jacket in issue 59, and even taking over the role of Wasp for a while. He is strange in the comics, the original creator of Ultron, though he forgot that, as we covered in our last video, and his most famous feat in the comic was when he became a wife beater in Avengers 2:13. Just one of those weird-ass ideas that the comics cooked up, I guess, to make Hank Pym less likable. Scott Lang first appeared in Avengers 181 before officially taking the Ant-Man mantle a month later in Marvel Premiere number 47. The idea of the character is similar to the film. Scott tries helping his family through crime, but reforms and becomes Ant-Man. Scott has largely been Ant-Man since, with another character, Eric O'Grady, becoming Ant-Man from around 2006 to 2012, but never catching on so well, with Scott being Ant-Man most of the time since the 1980s. Darren Cross in the film is a villainous businessman who eventually becomes Yellow Jacket. In the comics, he fought Scott Lang's version of Ant-Man after Darren was kidnapping people to transplant their hearts into his body since they would give him powers, something he found out at one point. It's confusing. Regardless, in the film he did a hostile takeover of Pym Industries and became the Yellow Jacket, an identity actually made up for Hank Pym, though they figured they'd use it to make a clone antagonist plot. Although the original Iron Man, Darren, first appeared in Marvel Premiere 47 and would take on the Yellow Jacket identity, but not until after this film came out. The horrible film Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium also made him MODOK, something the comics were not about to do later on. Even the often unhinged Marvel editorial department saw Darren as MODOK and knew that shit was stupid. We'll talk about that eventually, though. Hope Van Dyne, who goes on to become the Wasp and is the love interest of Scott, was not in the main Marvel universe and was based on Hope Pym of Earth 982, or MC2, short for Marvel Comics 2, a world that was kind of a small spin-off line of possible future books, most famously leading to a fairly long run on Spider-Girl, a Spider-Man spin-off about Spider-Man's daughter. Hope Pym in Marvel 2's continuity first appeared in A Next 7 and was the daughter of Hank Pym, though she's evil in that world. They pretty much just pulled the name, but I was gonna run with it and talk about it anyway, since I like to talk about small weird sidelines within the main Marvel publishing group, so there's a really brief history of MC2. The character is original to the film, but would soon be somewhat adapted into Nadia Van Dyne, who was Hank and his first wife Maria's kid. Whatever, she's kinda sorta original and kinda sorta never got adapted to the comics, but she was sort of just an ass-pull, so Scott Lang had a love interest. Finally, you have Cassie Lang, who's Scott's daughter, that eventually goes on to join the Ant-Man family and Young Avengers, first as Stature and then eventually as Stinger. It seems she's taking up the identity of Stature in the potential and eventual Young Avengers project after briefly playing the role in the third shitty Ant-Man film that we keep talking about. Each character in this film kind of falls into a category. You have Scott's family, Pym's family, the villains, and Scott's friends, but all points eventually converge on Scott and his battle with Darren Cross, or the Yellow Jacket. Scott starts the film as a recently reformed convict that can't hold a job because he has a big fat felony on his record, something that sees him even unable to work at a Baskin Robbins long term, a sort of running gag throughout this film series. Though this also means he is unstable and can't see Cassie, or he risks hurting her if he turns back to crime or moves or whatever. This stability, however, is offered by Hank and Hope, and he needs to basically do what he was doing before, but in the name of justice rather than greed and desperation. You also kind of get a sense that his friends are in a similar situation, seemingly kind-hearted, but just kind of seeing crime as a way of life since that is all they know. Regardless, Scott loves his daughter as he has a good heart and wants to work hard, but has no opportunities, with his key motivating factor to change to be what Cassie needs, but also the fact that he is perhaps a bit tired of the cycle of crime he ended up embedded in, which I think is an interesting angle for a superhero and something that isn't often tackled in these types of films. I perhaps wish there was a further explanation on what compelled him into crime in the first place, a hard childhood, being broke, or perhaps he was impulsive. But Scott doesn't ever really feel like a guy who just woke up and picked crime, and I think that's something they should have explored more, given this film is implying that it was so heavily baked into his past. And I also think it would have fit in this film, despite the occasional comedic tone, given the fact that it's not a downright comedy, and I think it would have been okay to add some human elements to Scott over pure absurdism. Hank is motivated by correcting his mistakes, perhaps realizing that he committed a crime against humanity with the Pym particles, and that in the wrong hands, being Darren's, serious harm could be done. On top of that, there's a danger to Pym particles with him losing his wife Janet to the quantum realm, where they assume she died due to going subatomic. His obsession with his work also led him to losing his company to his protege Darren, and being estranged from Hope, his daughter, taking her mother Van Dyne's maiden name, and more or less abandoning him for Cross and his company. Hope's motivations converge with Hank's early on, kind of like Scott. I would have liked more of a light bulb moment where she realized Darren, who she has a loose possible romance with, was a sociopath, and that her father has been changing for the better. I think that's what they went for, but it just doesn't quite hit the landing. She teams with Hank so quickly it doesn't even feel like a factor, despite Darren's trust in her being the backbone and the resolution to the villain's story, and also their somewhat implied romantic chemistry kind of being part of the reason Darren trusts her in the first place. Cassie, Maggie, and Jim are Scott's pseudo and perhaps slightly strange family. Cassie's his daughter, a cute little girl that doesn't understand the world and idolizes her dad despite him being sort of a loser and a criminal. Maggie's the baby mom, a woman that doesn't hate Scott, isn't scornful, and wants Scott to be with Cassie, but also knows that as a privilege he has to be stable enough to earn, which Scott proves throughout the film. Finally, Jim is the stepdad that is a cop and wants the best for Scott, but it's awkward since his wife's Scott's baby mom. You know how it goes. By the end of the film, Scott proves by working as Ant-Man he is doing good in the world and wants the best for his daughter, and despite Scott's unorthodox new lifestyle, the family happily accept him back into their lives. I think the story is simple, sweet, and probably works the best of the side stories and has the most fleshed out overall narrative. I like how they portray Maggie as a woman wanting the best for Scott and Cassie, and knowing that withholding Cassie is protecting her and not a punishment from Scott, who she does want around when the time is right. Jim also isn't an obstacle for Scott to make a new romance with Maggie. He isn't some dick Scott has to show up. He's a nice supportive guy who cares about Cassie and Maggie, and even grows to care enough about Scott despite the awkward step-parent vibe. I think that's a fairly feel-good thing and something kind of nice to portray for kids in blended families like this, since oftentimes step-parents are portrayed in media as just these awful fucking people. I think this is a nice little subplot and sort of the heart of the story and what works best. Next, you got Scott's criminal friends, Lewis, Kurt, and Dave, who are the comedic relief to make this film a bit more goofy and comedic. Each group Scott's around filling its own niche in the narrative. These guys are the goofballs with horrible advice for Scott, wanting the best for Scott while also being fucking stupid. Lewis does these funny story recaps that speeds through exposition, are usually pretty funny and work pretty functionally for the narrative.
He's like, yeah, you know what? I can't tell you who my contact is because he works with the Avengers. Oh, no. Yeah, and this dude sounds like a badass, man.
While Kurt and Dave round out the pseudo Three Stooges. Kurt being sort of the traditional seeming criminal who thinks he's smooth, and Dave being the kind of goofball who thinks he's the straight man of the group. It's a fun group, and they had some levity without going too far down the joke character route, and have some story function, while also being good pace setters and making the exposition fun and fast paced. Finally, you have Darren, a bald tuxedoed man, trying to sell the heroic scientist's grand breakthrough to the highest bidder after taking over their company, only to put on a superior supersuit to the hero and fight him, with the hero outsmarting the villain due to something they learned during the plot, despite the villain's superior supersuit.
My suit is more advanced in every way.
How'd you solve the icing problem?
Icing problem.
Oh shit, that picture was left over from my Iron Man video. I meant to put this picture. So yeah, I'm not sure if Darren was a pullover from an early draft, but why they basically made this character a one-for-one remake of the Ironmonger from the first movie was just baffling. I never loved the clone villain trope, where a supervillain has the same powers as the hero, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe loved pulling these ones out for a while. Hell, I made a video on this trope in 2017 before Black Panther came out, which, like, damn, I made that in college. I think I'm getting old.
I prefer my evil villain to be an evil balding man led by greed to copy the protagonist and ultimately get in a one-on-one deathmatch.
Regardless, it feels like a rehash, and really, he isn't that important to the narrative, and Jeff Bridges' Obadiah Stane is just so much better than Darren that I can't help but not really care for this villain. Plus, Darren in the comics was never Yellow Jacket until after the film came out, so like, why would they do this? Just to copy Ironmonger and not have to make something new? I don't get it. Had this character not been a one-for-one copy-paste from the villain from Iron Man, I may have considered him fine, albeit a bit undercooked. I mean, so much stuff happens in this movie. I think they forgot to really have the villain shine more. I also think he's too overtly evil. Like, he never plays dumb or tries to pull the trust of the protagonist or anything like Obadiah did, which is largely what I think makes that character superior. He's just always overtly sociopathic to all of the characters, but there's still, like, some trust there with Hope, or he's trying to convince him. I don't know. I don't really get what they were going for with him. Tonally, what kills me about this film is it feels very inspired by Edgar Wright, which makes me wonder why they fired him. I feel like the director could have done better than Peyton Reed, and that isn't really to bash Peyton Reed per se. What he did here was fine. But watching Edgar Wright's films like Hot Fuzz, Shaun of the Dead, or even Scott Pilgrim, the man is a master at creating suspenseful, hilarious, dramatic, compelling films while also having snappy, fast editing that this film largely tried to have anyways, despite firing Edgar Wright. It is very stylized. I think what we got was fine, but we basically could have had the Ant-Man equivalent of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, where an auteur who loves the character and is exceptional at his cinematic craft marries the mediums of comics and films beautifully, with what we got ending up being a fairly safe and run-of-the-mill superhero film. I think part of what broke up Wright and Marvel was largely that he wasn't willing to hide his style behind the formula with only tastes of what he does best. Look at Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I think we were all excited to see Sam Raimi put his spin on Doctor Strange in the way he did with Spider-Man, but there were only small tastes of what made him unique here and there behind the formula, something that he didn't really have to do so much on his Spider-Man films, which have his fingerprints all over the projects. Marvel and Wright probably hit an impasse where they would allow him to sprinkle some Edgar Wright in there, but it largely had to follow the formula, kind of like, as I said, Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness and Sam Raimi. They liked his pitch, but they needed to play it safe and have another obscure character succeed, or else the MCU would have fallen apart right there. I think that was largely the problem. I do think the idea of the tone was good, and I think Peyton Reed largely pulled it off well in his own way. I just think it could have been so much better. Musically, the film, which was composed by Christoph Beck, is bouncy and whimsical, less Marvel score and more old-timey heist film, think like the old Pink Panther films. Nothing super memorable, but it's perfect for a film like this and gets the job done right while being entertaining. Dan Lebenthal, who edited a lot of the Marvel films, including Thor: The Dark World, which we talked about earlier in our Phase 2 discussion, edited this film with Colby Parker Jr., who worked on some action films and concert films, and I think it's really well done, quick, exciting, and the effects are well integrated, making you feel like a tiny man. Also, I think Lewis's rants are creative and work well for the film. No notes there, they're edited very well. Russell Carpenter did the cinematography, known for tons of movies dating back to the 1980s, including shooting films like Titanic and the second Avatar movie. And while I think the latter especially looked really good, I think this movie is a little formulaic in look. It's bright, vibrant, and easy to decipher, but just looks really plain. Even with the shrinking gimmick, it lacks any moments I'm generally floored by in a cinematography sense. It's perfectly serviceable, but it sort of feels like the Marvel House style, and I wasn't super impressed if I'm being honest. Much like the film itself, it's serviceable, but not the best. Ant-Man has a mid-credits scene where Hank offers Hope her own wasp suit so she can fight alongside Ant-Man, having her own next time moment when Terrence Howard said next time to being War Machine.
Next time, baby.
I guess someone dons the suit next time, it just wasn't Terrence Howard. They just teased the Wasp identity, which we'll see in the next film. Whatever, it's sort of your standard end credits scene, nothing too crazy. The other end credits scene shows a brief clip from Civil War where Bucky, Cap, and Falcon are talking with a Falcon, convincing the other men to have Ant-Man join their side in Civil War. Nothing crazy, but yeah, some setup for the next one. One more thing to complain about. At one point, Hank makes a Hot Wheels sized tank into a big tank and then blows up like half of Darren's building, and then drives the tank off the 3rd floor of a building and survives. I feel like even if the tank wasn't ripped apart, physics would say he'd be violently thrown to the top of the tank and then drop down incredibly fast when the tank hit the ground, totally pulverizing him. The paramedics would be getting Hank out of that thing in buckets, but instead he was fine and it's all good. That's my one nitpick. That's my cinema sin. Well, Ant-Man is an okay film that could have been better. The hero plot is slightly convoluted, the villain plot a bit of a retread, and the cinematography is weak, but the editing and music was solid, the family drama was handled well, and much of the shrinking stuff was sort of interesting if nothing else. The film was fun and snappy, but probably would have been more fun and more snappy if they didn't fire an auteur Edgar Wright for a 9-to-5 filmmaker like Peyton Reed. It's pretty competent, but definitely not that special, and frankly is a pretty forgettable entry in the MCU franchise. My girlfriend was laughing hysterically throughout the whole film though, and I thought it was a pretty easy watch. And I think the two of us by the end of our watch agreed that this would be a great film to watch while you're like folding laundry or some shit. The film made a respectable but not groundbreaking $520 million off of a smaller budget of around $150 million. Not small, but smaller than some. The film has 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty good, with a 64 out of 100 on Metacritic. The film also won the 2015 award for Best Comic to Film Adaptation at the Saturn Awards, where it went up against Age of Ultron, Attack on Titan Part 1, The Peanuts, and Kingsman: The Secret Service. I don't really know, all of those movies were pretty subpar to me. Much like Phase 1, Marvel included some one-shots, which is a fancy name for short films that take place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The idea of a Peggy Carter short was cooked up by Marvel when they started working on these short films, though that was contingent that fans connected with Peggy the way Marvel hoped she would. After they were proved correct, Marvel one-shot Agent Carter was developed. Louis D. Esposito came to direct, Louis being the less famous co-president of Marvel Studios who previously directed the short Item 47 for the one-shot series. From there, they pretty quickly whipped up the film with Hayley Atwell coming back for her role as Peggy. The story takes place after Captain America the First Avenger, with Peggy working for the Strategic Scientific Reserve, which fails to respect Peggy the way they should due to the fact that she's a woman. Peggy is investigating Zodiac, a deadly chemical weapon, while the rest of the boys in the office refuse to let Peggy in on their part of the investigation. That is until Peggy receives a call being told the location of Zodiac. She heads in alone despite the caller saying she would need a team to take the serum back. Peggy beats down some henchmen and saves the formula, which leads to an offer for her to help run the newly formed organization S.H.I.E.L.D. as director with Howard Stark. Christopher Lenitz composed an era-appropriate score for the film that works well for the short, very much stylized to feel of the era, while Peter S. Elliott edited the film, who worked on Captain America the First Avenger, as well as being the head editor of 2012, that really bad Roland Emmerich film. Despite that, the short is pretty solid. Gabriel Burstein would shoot the film. He did a good job on it. I actually think the cinematography is better than some of the features in Phase 2. He would go on to work with the MCU a few years down the line when he shot Black Widow. The end credit scene sees Howard Stark showing Dum Dum Dugan bikinis as Howard explains the French made them. This is a solid enough short film, not much to it, it's just a bit of world building, though it's high quality and would probably partially lead to the Agent Carter TV show that would last 2 seasons. In the ABC TV universe, S.H.I.E.L.D. was established in 1949, though this short shows it was 1946. I'm inclined to believe the short though, since the Agent Carter show, along with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., have since been decanonized and moved to a different universe technically. This short, however, remains in Kevin Feige's sacred timeline. All Hail the King was a short based on Trevor that was featured on the Thor the Dark World Blu-ray. The short being somewhat of an apology for Iron Man 3's twist about the Mandarin, but also as a further look into the life of this supposed Mandarin. It was directed by Drew Pearce, who helped write Iron Man 3 with Shane Black. The short basically sees Trevor as a celebrity in prison, with him describing his elaborate lifestyle, ending with the interviewer revealing himself to be a member of the True Ten Rings who kidnaps him, something they would elaborate on years later in the Shang-Chi film. Brian Tyler did the music as a follow-up to Iron Man 3 with similar musical thesis. Dan Lebenthal edited this film, returning from Iron Man 3, and Michael Bouvillon shot The Thing. He also did Peacemaker, so I talked about him a bit in my Peacemaker Season 1 retrospective I did a while back. This was very much a continuation of the production of Iron Man 3, and while it didn't feature everyone who worked on that project, it largely brought that team back together to add some fun context to the creator of Trevor Slattery. I really liked the Justin Hammer cameo with Sam Rockwell returning to quip about Slattery.
His name's Trevor. What is that? Like if Bin Laden and Benny Hill had a baby.
And it's just a fun short, even if I think it's a little less standalone than the Agent Carter short, which more or less stands alone. It was also funny, and was a solid response by the filmmakers to the fans' constant bashing about Trevor at the time. For Phase 2, Marvel started to do some brief prelude comics. This includes Iron Man 3 Prelude, which sees Rhodey get his Hammer Tech parts removed from his suit following Justin Hammer upgrading Iron Man Mark II into War Machine in Iron Man 2, with Tony creating a Mark II War Machine suit to replace it as Rhodey investigates the Ten Rings terror group, with the group attacking him as War Machine. Following his escape, he learns of the Battle of New York and heads to assist, only to find the battle was already finished, explaining where he was during the events of the Avengers. Thor the Dark World Prelude sees Thor following the destruction of the Bifrost and the resulting War of the Realms causing issues. Years later, Frigga does some kind of projection thing that has her find her son Loki messing with the Tesseract, with the story jumping ahead to the Battle of New York and Loki's capture, and Jane is pissed at Thor for never hitting her up following the Battle of New York. It tries to kind of smooth out some of the plot holes between Thor and Avengers that were head-scratchers for fans. Doesn't have a ton about the plot of Thor 2, but it kind of smooths things out between Thor and Avengers. Guardians of the Galaxy Prelude sees Thanos adopt Gamora and Nebula, with him looking for Infinity Stones, and shows why Nebula has bionic parts, going on to show a brief Rocket and Groot encounter with the Crime Lord. Ant-Man Prelude shows Hank Pym create his Ant-Man suit, then Peggy tries shooting him before he dodges her attack, thankfully. I don't know, that bitch seems a bit psycho. Regardless, Pym goes on a mission to Berlin and crosses the Berlin Wall, then infiltrates a Hydra base. A few projects in various stages of development were planned for Phase 2 that never saw the light of day or were repurposed later on. Cable was a film pitched based on the X-Men character Cable. It's unknown how far this got or if Marvel even really owns the rights to Cable, with the character appearing in Deadpool 2, played by Josh Brolin. It is possible they somehow had the rights in a convoluted like Scarlet Witch Quicksilver way, but kind of hard to say. Dazzler was another character considered. She is something of a pop star and superhero who worked frequently with the X-Men, so much like Cable, the rights on her was pretty unclear, and while she isn't an X-Men, she may have technically been shared like Quicksilver or may have been at Marvel proper. Either way, it never came to be, and Dazzler is still a character who hasn't been adapted to the MCU. Iron Fist was another character that was being kicked around in 2009, but the character would be dropped by Marvel Studios and brought over to Marvel Television for a Marvel Netflix television series instead. Kazar was another character considered for film back in 2009, but again went nowhere, and to this day hasn't been seen in the MCU. Kazar is a human jungle man with cosmic powers, basically Marvel's take on Tarzan. An interesting enough character. Luke Cage was considered for a smaller scale film back in 2010, but again would be retooled to a Netflix show down the line, with him showing up in The Defenders. 2009 also saw Nighthawk, or the Kyle Richmond version, considered for film. Think Batman, but done by Marvel. He was referenced in the first season of Daredevil in episode 9, but could pretty easily be brought back in with very light retconning if they felt so inclined to bring him back later down the line. Power Pack was considered first in the year 2000 in collaboration with Artesian Entertainment. We kind of talked about that type of stuff with Ant-Man. Same thing applied to Power Pack. This is while they were sort of developing a pseudo-MCU before being bought by Lionsgate. Marvel, however, would revisit the idea like they would with Ant-Man. Unlike Ant-Man, though, Power Pack never saw the light of day. The Power Pack are a group of superpowered kids. Runaways was considered, starting production in 2008 with Brian K. Vaughan working on a treatment for the film after creating the characters for the page, with Peter Sollett set to direct the film. It would be kicked from the schedule following Marvel not having time for the project with a busy production slate. More than likely, they weren't getting the script to work right and just kind of canceled it quietly. The Runaways are a group of kids in LA that are the kids of supervillains from the team The Pride, a bunch of villains. Some are also from other villains, but, whatever. Runaways would eventually be retooled into a Marvel television TV show that for a while was considered MCU canon, though has since been retconned by Kevin Feige. Incredible Hulk 2 was planned, with Louis Leiter wanting to direct the sequel after directing the first film, and Tim Blake Nelson signing on to reprise his role as Samuel Stearns, who would become the leader in the film. The film would soon be put on ice, with Kevin Feige confirming they had no plans on making a sequel since Mark Ruffalo took over as the Hulk and Edward Norton left, with Mark Ruffalo saying in no uncertain terms that Universal still had the rights to distribute the Hulk films as of 2015, and Disney wasn't going to play ball with them and give them the distribution on it. Disney had the rights to use Hulk in the Avengers or even Thor Ragnarok, but if they made a Hulk solo project, it would cost Disney distribution, which didn't make sense for the company. It's a similar deal to Sony's Spider-Man deal, but it works slightly different. Marvel can't do whatever with Spider-Man the way they can with the Hulk, so they just said screw it and made Thor 3 a pseudo-Hulk sequel as well, ostensibly. Recently, Louis Leiter said he planned on putting Grey Hulk and Red Hulk into the proposed sequel. Hulk has since appeared in the aforementioned Thor 3, as well as the She-Hulk TV show in Disney+, plus several Avengers films and cameos here and there in films like Shang-Chi. Marvel's purported projects and cancellations were largely in early development and weren't really these close to production pieces the way the DCEU often was when I was talking about those in my DCEU video, so they rarely had directors attached, and despite many repurposed and canceled projects, it never affected the MCU's reputation the way it harms the DCEU, simply because they weren't coming out and announcing these films. These were just things that we have since heard were at one point or another in production at some form at Marvel. Well, that was the second phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and while I think Thor, The Dark World, Avengers Age of Ultron, and Ant-Man were all sort of mixed for me, I don't personally hate any of these films, and I think as a whole the quality of Iron Man 3, Winter Soldier, and Guardians were so impressive it's hard to mind that a few pretty meh films flanked them. I think things like Edgar Wright being taken off Ant-Man were missed opportunities, but I largely like this second segment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it was sort of the end of the runway, so to speak, with Phase 3 just being this massive thing that accumulated from years of planning and work that was set up between these growing series. Next up in my superhero film reviews, we're swapping back to DC with the DC serials. I mean, screw it, I may as well take it back to the top. After that, Marvel has a few options for me to explore. I might jump right into Phase 3, maybe I'll do the X-Men films or the Sony universe of Spider-Man characters. That concluded. Kraven was it. Kraven was apparently the last one. That'd be interesting to talk about, I suppose. Anyway, sound off below. I'm undecided where to go following my reviews of ancient 8-decade-old DC Universe films. Stick around for those. I'm sure some of you guys won't like those, but I'm gonna like those. Plus, you can learn about some really, let's say, interesting films that way by watching those videos.